Hello, my name is David Van Cleek. I'm a professor in the practice in the Center for Engineering Leadership at Rice University. Here on campus, I teach two courses, an undergraduate course for freshmen and sophomores, and a higher level course for seniors and graduate students. But a little bit about myself first. I too am an engineer. I did my undergraduate studies at Princeton University and graduated with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering in 1973. While I was at Princeton, I was enrolled in ROTC and was commissioned as a second lieutenant when I graduated. After graduation, I was stationed by the Army in Italy and Germany for 4 years before I decided to return to graduate school here at Rice University. And I finished my PhD here in 1981. Following my studies here at Rice, I joined Shell Oil Company as a research engineer and spent over 34 years doing individual research and as a manager in their organization. During my last 15 years at Shell, I also was a campus recruiter. So I had many opportunities to be on campus, to interview students, looking for those skills that I thought would help those candidates fit best into Shell's organization. I was specifically interested in their leadership abilities. I also draw in my leadership philosophy from my experience as a Boy Scout adult leader. So you will see throughout the specialization that I will use concepts from military, industry, and my Boy Scout experience to present to you those skills that I think will be most valuable for you as an engineering leader. As I close, I'd like to leave you with this thought, and it comes from my LinkedIn profile. I help engineers learn leadership skills so they can leverage their creative and technical skills to make a better world for all of us. My passion is teaching, and my joy is seeing others use what I show them. Welcome to the first course in the Leadership Development Specialization. This specialization consists of 3 courses: Awareness, Managing Relationships, and Action Planning. The first course is entitled Self-Awareness and consists of 5 modules. The 5 modules in this course follow the pipelines in the diagram. The first one is the overview of leadership. The second one, the engineering profession. Third, self-assessment tools. Fourth, managing stress. And finally, analytical and creative problem solving. You can expect each module in this course to take about a week. That will include the video lessons, the readings, and any supplemental assignments. Each module will end with a graded quiz. At the end of the course, we do have a written peer-reviewed assignment, but we'll talk more about that later on. I'd like to begin and end each module with a personal observation about leadership. So let's begin with today's observation. There's a linkage of this particular observation to the motivation to lead topics that we're going to talk about in Module 4. So today's observation is that understanding why you want to lead is an important first milestone on your journey to effective leadership. Our objectives in this lesson are to first understand the RSEL leadership framework. Within that, we'll talk a little bit about a technique called Bloom's taxonomy, and we'll begin to introduce some self-assessment tools. We'll talk some about journaling, establishing a leadership journal that you can use on your leadership journal. We'll introduce the concept of goal setting as a way of ensuring that you have an action plan to achieve success. We'll then end this particular module with a personal greeting exercise, which will be a tool that you can use as you network with others. Every organization has a framework that it uses to assess individual and technical skills. That framework is used most often in your annual performance review to establish your record of performance for the year. Within the Center for Engineering Leadership here at Rice, we have an engineering framework that we use as well. It consists of 4 domains: personal, interpersonal, management, and leadership, all hung together with a common thread of communications. Let's examine each of these individually. The personal domain consists of 5 skills. You'll notice that each of these we will cover in more detail throughout not just this module, but other modules within the course. In the interpersonal domain, we'll cover competencies that you will see again in the action planning course as part of this specialization. Within the management skills, these begin to have competencies that will be discussed in much more detail in the communications and the project management specializations. And as we move forward to the leadership domain, these are skills that we will cover across all of the specializations in the certificate. Your organization may have its own leadership framework. As we work on our leadership development plan as part of this course, please feel free to use whatever framework works for you, whether it's your own organization or the RCEL model. Now that we've introduced the concept of a leadership framework with competencies, we need to spend some time to talk about how we'll measure skill level proficiency for each of those competencies. This will become particularly important as you work on your leadership development plan and set goals and targets for your skill level proficiency. Here within the Center for Engineering Leadership, we use Bloom's taxonomy. This 6-level scale gives us an indication of level of proficiency for each of those skills. Let's begin with the base level, that of remembering. This is the ability to retrieve out of long-term memory relevant facts to use on the job. At the next level, understanding is the ability to make sense out of it and put it in context. At the applying level, this is the ability to use the skill appropriately on the job. As we move further up, the analyzing level, this is the ability to break the skill into its component parts, relate those parts to each other, and perhaps to relate them to other leadership competencies. At the evaluating level, we're talking about using all of the information related to that skill to make effective decisions. This is the decision-making level of the taxonomy. At the top level, that of creating, this is the ability to use all of the information, all of the analysis to take decisions in a new and different direction, to apply those skills in different settings and different contexts. As a recruiter for my organization on college campuses, one of my expectations was that when I was interviewing students, those that I was looking for in particular would at a minimum be at the analyzing level of both their technical and leadership skill competencies. As you develop your leadership plan as part of this course, you will use Bloom's taxonomy to assess not only where you are today, but to establish targets for where you want to be in the future. In this lesson, I will introduce the concept of the leadership journal. This will be an ungraded supplemental exercise that I encourage you to use throughout the specialization. It will help you reinforce the lessons and collect your thoughts as you prepare for the written assignment at the end of the course. Let me first start by reviewing the expectations and purpose. The purpose of the journal is for you to record your thoughts about leadership, a chance to collect your experiences and analyze those in such a way that you can derive insights and potentially some actions for future development. What am I expecting? I'm expecting you to critically analyze course material, your experiences, and your reflections on what you've learned. Because you're writing this journal to yourself, it is perfectly acceptable to write it in your native language, whichever you are most comfortable with. Before you sit down to write, I want you to think about what it is the topic will be. Give some preparation for that so that you can develop it appropriately. Develop those ideas as fully as you can. Try to make as many connections to the course material as possible. Make sure that you have a focus for each entry that you make in your journal so that it will help you in the future as you develop your leadership plan. As you sit down to write, please try to find a location where there are few distractions and you can concentrate on what you do. I have personally found that it's very useful to try to find a particular time each day where I can do my journaling so that it becomes routine and habitual. Again, handwrite your comments. I find that handwriting the comments helps burn those thoughts into your memory and makes it easier to recall later on. As you do the journaling, leave a little bit of space so that when you come back from time to time, you can add additional thoughts. I've found that my own thoughts change over time and evolve, and I'm sure yours will as well. So give yourself that opportunity to change as your thoughts change. I'm specifically looking for certain things in those journal entries. What I really hope that you capture are the connections to the course material, what insights you gain about leadership, and most importantly, what are the implications for your development as a leader? What actions will you take as a result of what you've learned? Now that we've discussed the leadership framework and a way of measuring skill level for the competencies within the framework, let's begin our journey towards self-awareness with talking about personality assessments. In this course, we're going to do two different personality assessments. One is called the Big Five, the Neo-IP, or the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator. You have an opportunity to do both of those. However, there are some cautions I'd like to provide before you do that. First, recognize that these assessments are prone to errors. As you take these tests, there are opportunities to inject your own biases and concerns and preferences as you do the test. I encourage you as you do each of these personality assessments to answer the questions not as you would like to be, but as you currently are. We do these because few of us really have adequately developed skills to do a good self-assessment. We're going to rely on these self-assessments and the input from others during the course of our work here to get a more accurate picture of what we're really like and how we function in a leadership role. I caution you that there's no good or bad in these outcomes. They're just results. As you look at the results and you find surprises, that should represent for you an opportunity to find validating information. Use those surprises as ways of finding out more about yourself. Try to find information that will either refute the outcome or validate it. The Big Five personality assessment uses a numerical scale. I caution you that there is no good or bad associated with that scale. It's tempting in our world to assign high value to the high end of that scale. That's not true in this particular case. With the Big Five, the scale only represents a tendency towards one extreme or the other. So there's no intrinsic meaning in the scale. When you find results that are contrary to your expectations, or if you would like to get a more detailed picture and more complete picture, there are longer versions of both of these assessments that are available, and I would encourage you to take those if you have any particular concerns. With that out of the way, let's begin to talk now about specifically the Big Five. The Big Five personality traits: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience. On the surface, these words conjure up certain images based on our experiences. I would caution you to be careful on how you use that. In the sense of this personality assessment, extroversion really refers to how do you get your energy in a group of people. If you are energized by being around others, you're at the higher end or the extroversion end of the scale. If being with others is a more draining experience, you're probably more towards the introverted end. Agreeableness really refers to how do you deal with conflict? Do you avoid conflict at the high end of this extreme? Or are you more tolerant of conflict in the workplace and that would be towards the lower end of the agreeableness scale. Doesn't necessarily mean you're disagreeable. The conscientiousness scale really refers to structure. How do you like to structure what you do? If you like high structure, you're probably at the high conscientiousness end of the scale. If you're more tolerant of less structure, then you're at the low end. The neuroticism scale doesn't really mean that you're neurotic if you're at the high end. It really means that you typically will have an emotional response to the things that happen around you. If you tend to be less susceptible to an emotional response, that you're calm under stress, you're calm in demanding circumstances, then you're probably at the low end of the neuroticism scale. On the openness to experience scale, this really refers to what is your tolerance for ambiguity. Those at the high end of the openness to experience scale are more welcoming of new and different experiences. Those at the lower end of the scale tend to prefer routine and structure. At the conclusion of this lesson, you'll be given instructions on how to access both the Big Five and the Myers-Briggs personality assessments. We encourage you to go out and take those before you proceed further. We will discuss the results of these personality assessments throughout the other modules of this course. I would like to plant the seed now for you to consider what are the potential implications of your personality assessment in developing your leadership style. In this lesson, I'll introduce the concept of goal setting. We'll explore this topic in much more detail later on in the course. However, for now, there may be some tips and techniques that you can put into practice right away. So let's begin by talking about why do we set goals. First, these are relevant to your personal life. You can achieve greater satisfaction in your personal life through the application of this goal-setting process. It certainly will help you in your professional life by accomplishing those things that will reinforce not only your career, but also your leadership skills. This is a first step towards managing your behavior in a more efficient and productive way. Here are some of my preliminary thoughts about setting goals. I like this quote from Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland: "If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there." But I also have what I call my articles of faith about setting goals. It begins with having a direction, having good objectives, things that you want to accomplish, reinforcing that with a well-structured, SMART goal, and having, most importantly, an action plan that will help you achieve the goal. Let's further this discussion by talking about what is a SMART goal. SMART is an acronym. Many of you may already be familiar with the acronym, but let's step through it here. First, goals must be specific. If they're too general, they're going to be difficult to not only measure, but also accomplish. They must be measurable. You must be able to quantify it so that you know when you've completed the goal. All SMART goals revolve around an action verb. You're going to do something. Not something's going to happen, but you are going to take an action. They must be realistic. If they're unrealistic goals, your commitment to accomplish them will not be very high. And every good goal has a time bound associated with it, that you're going to accomplish it in a specific period of time. SMART goals are statements that provide direction. They contain that action verb and enough clarifying information so that you fully understand what the goal means. As I mentioned a moment ago, all well-crafted goals contain action verbs. This is an inventory of potential action verbs that you might choose to use in your own goal statements. Be sure to use action verbs because it means that you own the action and you're not expecting somebody else to take it for you. In this lesson, I will share my thoughts about what constitutes engineering leadership. In my own leadership journey, I've had ample time to reflect on what distinguishes an engineering leader from all other leaders. In doing so, I've come up with this model for how I would express engineering leadership. It's action-oriented and has 5 components. First, engineers have to communicate. They cannot get actions done without their ability to explain them clearly to the non-technical person. Within this certificate program, we have an entire specialization devoted to communications. Engineers solve problems. They use their technical skills, well-developed technical skills, to solve both analytically and creatively the problems they're faced with. They make decisions, they make choices, technical choices throughout all of the work that they do. They also, because they are a profession, they have to apply ethical standards to everything that they do. In order to get work done, engineers have to work through others. They must manage the relationships that they have with other engineers, with their supervisors, with vendors, and others out in the workplace. Ultimately, being an engineer is about delivering results. The way that engineers do that is through projects. We will have an entire specialization in this certificate devoted to how to manage and conduct projects. One of the things that I had hoped to achieve during the course of the certificate that you're enrolled in is to give you a sense for what it's like to be a student here at Rice University. So today we're doing some work on location, and I'm standing right now in the middle of the academic quadrangle with the statue of William Marsh Rice behind me. He was the benefactor who donated the money that led to the creation of the university. Today we're going to practice the initial meeting interview, a technique that you might use when you're meeting somebody for the first time who is a potential networking candidate for you. We'll look for those things that you ought to practice as you meet somebody new. So now, let's see if we can find somebody on campus to ambush. Hi, I'm Dave Van Cleek. Do you have a few minutes that I could chat with you?
Of course, my name's Jenna. It's nice to meet you, Dave.
Pleased to meet you. I've seen you on campus walking backwards with large groups of people.
Yes, that would be me.
What's that all about?
So I am a tour guide for the Welcome Center, which does tours for both middle school and elementary school students and VIPs from either from diplomatic corps to presidents of other universities who want to see the campus.
How do you get to be a tour guide?
So there's two different types of tour guides, actually. There's one through the admissions office, which does the typical tours for high school seniors and juniors and their parents. And every semester or so, they send out the application to all the Rice students. And they basically, if you love Rice, apply here and you do a quick interview. And then they give you all the training needed to be a tour guide. And then for the Welcome Center, it's pretty similar.
Okay. Well, Jenna, from time to time, I host special visitors on campus, and I was wondering, how would I go about arranging a tour for them?
If your special visitors were not high school juniors or seniors or prospective students looking to come here, you would contact Seraphim Van at the Welcome Center, and she'd be more than happy to arrange that for you. She'll set you up with a tour guide. And the nice thing about the Welcome Center is we can do personalized tours. So I've done 30-minute tours for elementary school children because they don't really have attention spans longer than that, and given presentations, but I've also done hour-and-a-half tours for presidents of universities who want to see like every aspect of campus. So you can really personalize your tour with the Welcome Center if you wish to do so.
So if I wanted you to give a tour for some of my visitors,
okay,
how would I reach out to you so that I got you for my tour guide?
You would probably just tell Serafina that
okay,
you could probably request me, and if it's on a day that I can make it, because I only work Tuesdays, Thursdays, because there are other tour guides who I promise you are equally good,
okay,
who work other days who can do your tour as well if it doesn't match up.
So if I'm on a Tuesday or Thursday, just request you, and you're okay with that?
I'll be there. I'm very excited about that. It's very flattering.
Okay, well, great. Well, if you need to reach out to me for anything, here's my business card.
Well, thank you very much.
Look forward to contacting you and seeing you again around campus walking backwards.
Well, it was nice to meet you, Dave.
Nice to meet you, Jenna.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. Now that you've had a chance to view the personal greeting interview, and we're back in the studio, we can take a fresh look at this via instant replay. Remember that we talked about the greeting, where we were focused on the stance, the voice, the handshake, eye contact. Be aware of those as we look at the video. Also, make note of the conversation where we establish points of mutual interest. Then be on the lookout for how we close the conversation. how we set up the opportunity for potential future interactions. And then lastly, make sure that you catch how we manage agreement on any potential follow-up from this particular conversation. So with that in mind, let's take a fresh look at this particular conversation. As I begin to find a candidate, I identify one here. Let's stop here. Note as we approach here that I identify myself. I try to do this in a non-threatening way. I make sure that she knows my name and what my position here is on campus. So we'll be on the lookout for that. But before we progress to that, I'd like for you to notice in the background here is my colleague, Gail Moran. You're going to meet her in the second course on communications. So again, look for the verbal greeting and the handshake. Dave Van Cleek, do you have a few minutes that I can check there? Okay, and what you see again is a firm handshake, okay, but not so firm that I crush her hand. We don't want to do that. This is a customary greeting in American culture. And so we'll move on from here. Chat with you.
Of course, my name's Jenna. It's nice to meet you, Dave.
Pleased to meet you. Let's stop there. Notice that she gave me her name, okay? So I now know that her name is Jenna. And I'm going to want to try to use that later on in our conversation. Notice also here that we're starting the precedent for the rest of the conversation to have good mutual eye contact. Not staring, but maintaining that eye contact. And so let's move on. I've seen you on campus walking backwards with... Here I'm trying to establish, I've seen her before and I wanted to follow up on having seen her before.
Which does tours for both middle school and elementary school students and VIPs from either from diplomatic corps to presidents of other universities who want to see the campus.
And let's stop here. And what you've seen is I've started to use some gestures to help reinforce the points that I want to make. I don't want to overdo it too much, but I do want to show that I'm actively listening and that I'm engaged in this conversation. Be on the lookout for any nonverbal gestures that I'll be using, and in particular in this conversation, for any particular head nods that I use to acknowledge that I understand the message that she's giving me. So let's move on. Tour guide.
So there's two different types of tour guides, actually. There's one through the admissions office, which does the typical... And
let's stop here. Tour. And what's interesting to note in this particular conversation, and you may observe this too in your own, is that Jenna is actually mirroring some of my gestures. Not only the gestures, but the eye contact as well. And I think you'll find that as I smile, she does too. So let's move on.
This is for high school seniors and juniors and their parents, and every semester or so they send out the application to all the Rice students, and they basically, if you love Rice, apply here and you do a quick interview, and then they give you all the training needed to be a tour guide. And then for the Welcome Center, it's pretty similar.
And again, let's stop here. Back it up just a little bit. There we go. All right, and again, you can see the eye contact, the mirroring of expressions and gestures. And what I think is really fascinating about this is that you can see that my candidate here, Jenna, has great school spirit. So let's move on from here. Okay. Well, Jenna, from time to time, I host special visitors on campus, and I was wondering, how would I go about arranging a tour for them?
If your special visitors were not high school juniors or seniors or prospective students looking to come here, you would contact Seraphim Van.
Let's stop here for a moment. It's always interesting to note in video productions that you can occasionally have what I call a wardrobe malfunction. What is going on here? That's, I guess, what happens when I don't wear my course studio shirt. Let's move on.
At the Welcome Center, and she'd be more than happy to arrange that for you. She'll set you up with a tour guide. And the nice thing about the Welcome Center is we can do personalized tours. So I've done 30-minute tours for elementary school children because they don't really have attention spans longer than that.
And at this point in the conversation, I'm anticipating that the conversation is going to come to a close. We have something of interest here, something in common, and I may want to establish how to follow up. And let's stop there. Okay, so again, I was using the gestures to emphasize the points I was making, the eye contact, and I'm going to make sure that I know how to contact her when I need to, that she knows how to reach me, and that is okay with her. So let's proceed. For some of my visitors,
Okay.
how would I reach out to you so that I got you for my tour guide?
You would probably just tell Serafina that
Okay.
you could probably request me, and if it's on a day that I can make it, because I only work Tuesdays, Thursdays, because there are other tour guides who I promise you are equally good,
Okay.
who work other days who can do your tour as well if it doesn't match up.
So if I'm on a Tuesday or Thursday, just request you, and,
Yeah,
and
I'll-
you're okay with that?
I'll be there. I'm very excited about that. It's very flattering.
Okay, well, great. Let's stop there. Okay, and back it up just a little bit. And we notice here, we have the smile, great, the eye contact, and the gestures. And the message that I'm receiving here is that when I asked about establishing an ongoing or follow-up for our particular conversation here, she's okay with that. And all of the signals, verbal and nonverbal, suggest to me that that's going to be okay with her. And you're going to want to look for those same things. Let's proceed. Okay, well, great. Well, if you need to reach out to me for anything, here's, and we'll stop there. And here, I gave her my card as a way for her to reach out to me if she wants to follow up with me in any way, and you may want to consider doing something very similar. Okay, and let's move on.
Thank you very much.
Contacting you and seeing you. And then lastly, as we begin to separate, we do the handshake again. It's always appropriate. Again, not too firm, but strong. And we're going to close, making sure that we leave on a friendly note with a smile. So let's see you, Jenna.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. And back there, one more, little forward. There we go. So here we have the smile. Obviously you want to leave on a positive note. That brings us to the end of the interview. I hope you saw in this interview examples of the things that you're going to want to replicate in contacts that you have as you build your professional network. Remember the greeting, stance, posture, voice, the handshake, the conversation, trying to establish items of mutual interest, the close and goodbye, where you're going to establish that it's okay to have an ongoing contact, and then make sure that you have a way that you can follow up with each other. Again, I hope that you are able to use this particular tool as you extend your professional networks on your leadership journey. Today, we're coming to you from the Heinemann Garden, located between Fondren Library and the Rice Student Center. From time to time, we'll come here as I present my reflections from my own journaling experience that are applicable to the particular module that we're studying. So with that in mind, let me begin with an observation from our first module. In this module, we talked about a model for engineering leadership. I've been fortunate to have had leadership positions continuously for over 50 years. From my experience in Boy Scouts as a youth, high school in student government, honor society, in college ROTC, a commissioned officer in the Army, as a manager at Shell, and now also as an adult leader in Boy Scouts. So with that in mind, I framed a pretty good picture of what leadership is. So when the question was posed recently in the Center for Engineering Leadership of what is an engineering leader, I had to think about that a little bit. What is it that distinguishes the engineering leader from all other leaders? As I focused on that, I thought, well, I know what at least 4 things are that all leaders do, and those were the sides of the diagram that I showed you in the earlier video model. But communications, managing relationships, making decisions, and solving problems were kind of obvious to me for all leaders. What wasn't so obvious is what now distinguishes the engineering leader from all others. As I thought about that, I had one of those moments where I experienced the illumination moment that we'll talk about later in creative problem solving. That time when the light goes on. And in my case, it became clear that what differentiates engineering leaders from all others is the way they deliver their work, and that is through projects. So my challenge to you from this module is, as you think about engineering leadership, what does that term mean to you? Congratulations, we've almost reached the end of our very first module. But before we leave, I want to take a moment to review what we've covered in this module. If you can recall, we began talking about the overall course structure. I encourage you to go back and review that so that you stay familiar with it as we progress. We talked about the leadership framework. This is where we're going to draw upon those competencies that we'll be using throughout the course to assess our progress, set goals, and ultimately develop our leadership plan. We talked about Bloom's taxonomy. That is the tool that we'll be using to assess the skill level for each of those competencies within the framework. We talked about the Big Five personality assessment, and later on, the Myers-Briggs personality assessment. We'll be using these tools specifically for addressing the self-awareness competency within the framework. We talked about journaling, the need to reflect on the lessons that you've learned and to provide yourself a means to come back to over time to see how your thoughts have changed. This activity is also tied to the self-awareness competency. We talked about setting goals, the overall framework for it, and the need to have SMART goals properly structured with a supporting action plan. Goal setting is a specific competency in itself within the leadership framework. We then concluded with the personal greeting, the networking tool that you can use right now as you go out to extend your professional network and perhaps even your personal one. It also contains the challenge that I put to you for this module so that between now and your starting of the next module, you go out and practice the personal greeting. Good luck as you take on that challenge. Welcome to Module 2. Today we're going to spend some time talking about what it's like to be an engineer in the real world. What are the challenges that you're going to be faced with, and what are the things that you're going to have to be concerned with as you adapt your professional learning and development to fit into the modern world. But first, let's start with my leadership observation for the day, and that is that effective leaders never stop learning. We'll revisit this thought at the end of the module. For now, let's move on to what the objectives of this module will be. First, understand those challenges out there for engineers in the 21st century. The basis for that will be the National Academy of Engineering publication, The Engineer of 2020. We will model an engineer interview to show you what you will need to do for your written assignment in this course, and that is to conduct the engineer interview. Lastly, we will review some tools that you can use now to help prioritize your activities and goals to make a better, more effective leadership development plan. Now, let's get started. Today, I'm coming to you from the Engineering Quadrangle on the Rice University campus. Behind me are the three sculptures known as 45, 90, and 180. In my classroom version of this course, when we talk about the Engineer of 2020, I like to do a classroom demonstration that I will replicate here for you today. Here I've replicated the timeline that you heard described earlier in the Kennedy speech when he compared the technology timeline to a 50-year period of human history. Here I've created the timeline where each foot of this timeline represents 200 years of recorded history. I begin with what is arguably one of the most significant technological advances of ancient man, and that is the development of the wheel, roughly 5,500 years ago. It's worth noting on this scale, the last ice age in North America occurred 100 feet that direction. Homo sapiens as a species has been around for about 200,000 years, or about 1,000 feet in that direction. The dinosaurs disappeared from the face of the earth 62 miles away, or roughly 100 kilometers. And finally, the origin of the earth itself, somewhat over 4 billion years ago, would be 4,000 miles away. So let's progress along the timeline to see how technology has changed over the years. I've marked here the times of Julius Caesar, roughly 2,050 years ago, when Rome was at its height in terms of technology and architecture. I've marked here the invasion of England by the Normans in 1066 as a precursor to the Renaissance. And clearly by the time of Christopher Columbus in 1492, his journeys to North America to open up the continent to further exploration. This was clearly at the time of the Renaissance. I would suggest that one of the greatest technological advances following the Renaissance was the invention of the steam engine. The steam engine itself enabled human endeavors to be automated in ways that were unprecedented. Certainly, by the time of Robert Fulton in 1804, the invention of the steamboat allowed rapid transportation to develop. That was subsequently followed by the railroad. Just as transportation was experiencing advances in technology, so were communications. We had the invention of the telegraph by Samuel Morse in 1833. Now we were able to communicate over longer distances much more rapidly. That was followed not too much later, in 1876, with voice communication through the telephone, the invention by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Arguably one of the most significant advances, enabling man now not to be limited to daylight hours, to be able to work 24 hours a day if needed, to operate that period anyway, was the invention of the light bulb by Thomas Edison in 1879. Coming not too far after that was the first manned space flight, or manned flight by the Wright brothers in 1903, leading to the first manned space flight less than 60 years later. The jet engine, invented in 1944, a significant step forward in speeding up the way man can move across large distances. The first programmable computers came in 1945, and the advances in electronics were speeded up by the invention of the transistor in 1947. We have the first manned spaceflight in 1961, followed less than 9 years later by putting the first men on the moon. One of the early personal computers was the Commodore PET. It appeared in 1977, followed by the Apple Mac in 1984. All in the space of the knot at the end of this rope lie technology advances in how we store information that we use in our computing. Early in the use of personal computers came the 5 1/4 floppy disk. This is mid-1980s technology. It held an astounding 360 kilobytes of data. It was followed roughly around 1990 by the 3.5-inch floppy, which multiplied the ability to store by a factor of 3. By the year 2000, we were able to use larger storage devices that achieved 100 megabytes in this zip drive, where today we now store on flash drives in excess of 100 gigabytes. That amazing growth in the ability to store information matches and mirrors the acceleration of technology on this timeline. As another indicator, I like to show my students how I did my calculations when I was an undergraduate. I completed my engineering studies using this slide rule as my personal computer. What should be obvious to you as you look at the pace of change is that it is accelerating at an astounding rate. So the challenge to you as you face being not only an engineer but a leader in this environment of change is how will you keep up? How will you adapt? And what new ways of working will you use to deal with this kind of change. You've just finished reading the pamphlet, The Engineer of 2020 from the National Academy of Engineering. Even though this pamphlet was written in 2004, it still has lessons of great value for us as we examine how the profession of engineering will evolve over time. Now we'll take an opportunity to review a few of the key concepts that I would like for you to take away from this publication. First, in the past, changes in engineering profession and engineering education have followed changes in technology and society. This outcome poses great risk for us in terms of how we restructure our education and how we restructure our profession so that it can keep pace. What is the risk if we don't accomplish that? One of the outcomes that I have seen in my professional life has been that you as an engineer will have to do most of your education to catch up and keep pace with society while you're on the job. You will have to adapt your learning style and your own development plans to accommodate that change in pace and in the lag. It will force you to become that lifelong learner that I mentioned early in the module. Secondly, does this outcome really serve the best interests of our nation and the world if we allow education and the profession to lag behind? First risk is that we may not be able to produce enough engineers to meet the technological needs of the future. It also means that we will have to adapt. We will have to come up with new ways of learning, new ways of filling in the gaps as those gaps continue to grow, while at the same time focusing attention on how do we really change the way we learn. The fact that you're here now suggests that you are taking one of those steps. What will it be like to be an engineer in 2020? What are the things that you'll be faced with? What are the challenges? We already know that the way you do your work, whether it's computational, hands-on, mechanical, field work, all of that is evolving. Will you be working from an office or will you be working from a desk in your house? All of these things are key issues that need to be addressed so that we don't overlook the essential elements of interacting with other engineers and delivering results. What's the best way to educate them? Part of it may be courses like this one. Certainly, an aspect of it will be, as you work with your supervisor, how do you build in opportunities to learn new skills? How do you develop those that you have? And how do you find new opportunities? Among the variety of topics covered in the Engineer of 2020, these were specifically outlined. I wanted to take a moment to show you how these connect to our certificate program. Those that are outlined in orange in this list are ones that we will cover specifically in the leadership specialization. Those in blue are covered in the communications specialization, and those in black will be covered in the project management specialization. So my challenge to you here is, what skills do you not have now that you need to develop in order to be an effective engineer in the years to come? Welcome to the engineer interview portion of this module. Today we were fortunate to have two engineers with us in the room, and our purpose here is twofold. First, to emphasize the lessons that came out of the Engineer of 2020 article, and secondly, to model the interview that you'll be doing in our second course. So today I'd like to introduce our two engineers, and if you would please give us a little bit about your background and experiences as an engineer, and particularly as an engineering leader in industry. And first of all, before you start, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to be here.
Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Tom?
My name is Tom Phelan. I am a lecturer at Rice University in the Center for Engineering Leadership. Prior to that, I spent 38 years with Fluor. Fluor is an engineering construction company with revenues of about $30 billion a year. and about 45,000 employees worldwide. Most of my career was spent in project management. I started as a process engineer, a chemical engineer, and eventually rose up through the ranks doing that. Managed projects of up to about 300 or 400 people, and for about 3 years was in charge of the project execution services in the Houston office, which meant I was directly responsible for about 2,500 people. So of course during that time had to improve my leadership skills and learn how to interact with that number of people.
So I'm Chuck Roberts, and I also am a lecturer at the Rice Center for Engineering Leadership. I come to this job after 37 years with ExxonMobil, all in the upstream with various positions. My last position was working on a reorganization of the upstream engineering business, which came about because of all of the many jobs I've had. Like Tom, I managed groups of up to 1,500, which was fun, but also groups of as few as 2 or 3. And in all, you need leadership skills, and you need to understand the various aspects that will get people to do what they need to do.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's take a step back. How did you happen to end up in that leadership role?
Well, actually, it's kind of a funny story. As I said, I started as a process engineer, and in the course of starting the engineering, I interacted with all the other disciplines and started working with them and helping them solve problems. And one day, my boss, the project manager, came and said, "You're in everybody's business. We're just going to put you in charge of things." So I guess it was because I just got involved in everything, and I'd like to say it was a plan, but it really wasn't. It was just my natural curiosity turned into put me in a leadership position.
Okay.
Kind of the same story for me. You just work hard and learn and expand your responsibilities, push out into other areas of business so that you can integrate that into your assigned responsibilities. Did that as a drilling engineer, ended up in Alaska drilling wells up on the North Slope, and by doing that, understood and learned all of the parts of logistics and production engineering, and just like Tom, as you slowly but surely understand more and more of the business and spread out, the responsibility comes to you and you end up being a leader.
Sure, so it sounds like there wasn't just a definite plan that you had going into it, but that when the opportunity arose, you naturally stepped into that kind of role.
That's probably a pretty fair statement. We all like to think we have a grand plan, but usually it's kind of just we rock along and do what we enjoy, and the next thing we know, we're in that spot.
You are where you are. It's kind of the journey destination thing. Don't worry about the destination so much. Just make sure the journey's of high quality.
So that kind of begs the question of, were you consciously aware of doing anything to prepare to step into those first leadership roles?
I think the sort of the aha moment for me was I was on a project, and it was this project where they had put me in as a project engineer for the first time. And I was watching the project manager, and I thought that he was sort of old and slow and doing things all the wrong way. And I was very frustrated. And I stepped back and said, wait a minute, this guy's been doing this 40 years, run some very successful projects. There's a lot of things he must be doing right. I just need to step back and figure out what he's doing. And so I think that was sort of, where I really sat back and said, I need to start studying these various people in positions of leadership and understanding how they're making their decisions, what are they doing that's making them successful. It's not obvious. And sometimes it seems magical, but it took 9 months for me to figure out that some of the things he did today, he did because he was preparing for 9 months from now.
Well, in that vein, were there some role models or mentors that you had in those early days that helped you on that pathway?
Definitely, definitely. There were people who, along the way, who took an interest and helped with certain skills and certain attributes along the way. It's important to look for those people and hopefully for them to look for you. And I think most leaders naturally are open to helping people if you go and sit down with them and ask for advice. And I think that's one of the great sort of learnings when I look back that helped is I tended to just go sit down in somebody's office and start asking questions and let them sort of guide me along the way. You probably had similar experience.
Yeah, good people will teach you. And if you ask to be taught, they'll be happy to teach you. To just add a little bit to Tom's response, there's role models that are positive and role models that are negative. And as a kind of student of the human species, you ought to look at both, and you learn from all of them. And that's one way to grow as a leader. Just make sure that you see what impact others have on others and what they have on you, and try to choose and pick your behaviors from that.
We've recently in this module talked about the Engineer of 2020 article. One of the key themes in that is the pace of change in technology. Mm-hmm. And clearly your careers, like mine, spanned a period of dramatic change in the profession. Can you describe some of the challenges that you faced in dealing with that over the course of your careers?
Change is something that's going to be here, has been here, and will be here in more intensity. I think it's important to understand that and to not try to set your mind on some kind of a predetermined plan. You can move in a direction that's positive, and as you move in that direction, assess the situation at all times and accept the change that happens. If you don't, you are going to suffer some stress because you'll be in a place where no one else is. They've changed and you're not there. So be ready for it and accept it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I saw through the course of that career was that the way people work and the way we interact with each other changed quite a bit. I think today there's a lot more data available, and so the skill set to absorb and analyze that data is quite a bit different. We can get overloaded and get confused. I think, one of the things I found is that as you move along, some of those skills that you relied on early on and you thought were great get overtaken by technology, and then all of a sudden you go back and try to do something, and nobody needs a graph paper and a slide rule anymore, and so all those skills are
What's a slide rule?
out the window. Right. So I did have that moment where I asked somebody to do some calculations for me, and I went back and said, well, where are all these charts and graphs? And they looked at me like, what planet did you come from?
Well, that brings up an interesting question of how do you keep up from an engineering skills standpoint with that pace of change?
You just do what you've done all your life. You learn.
You learn on the job.
On the job, every day. Technology changes. As we're engineers, we have got a skill set in understanding technology, and as the technology moves, move with it.
Yeah, I think the answer is almost in two parts. It's if you're in a technical role and you're trying to lead there, you're going to have to do some studying and learn some new technology and learn some new tools and get into that. If you're on the other side, sort of where I got to be, more operations, overseeing big groups, then you're really looking at, how do I do that without understanding the underlying technology? Because if you're trying to learn, your skill set's learning how people interact in this sort of global environment.
Yeah, it's managing the cultural shifts. Not only technology change, but I agree with you. The way people interact and the way people do their business, the way people analyze, the way people create changes over time. And you have to accept the cultural shifts that are occurring and be part of them.
I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges, at least for me, from an engineer moving into a leadership role, is trying to get used to the fact that you're leading a group of people and you're not the expert in whatever they're doing, right?
Can't be.
You might not even be able to know whether they're right or wrong. And how do you figure out where you're going and what you're doing without actually being able to do the work yourself?
Yeah, it can be limiting. Like all of it. Well, like you've seen, I'm sure you'll find managers who try to understand everything and try to be the expert when the experts are there with them. Just need to let them go.
In that vein, as a manager, how did you ensure that your staff did keep current with the current technology, and how did you help them develop their skills?
Most of the people I worked with, and I think you'll find this to be true of people in general, want to be the best. And you just let them be the best. You give them the opportunities to learn, give them the opportunities to improve their technical capabilities. If they're not doing that, you encourage them in one way or another.
Okay.
I think typically my approach is always, and I learned this from one of my early mentors, is asking the right questions, asking a lot of very sort of leading questions to make sure that they've thought through all the things they need to think through. And one question is always, is there somebody else we should be talking to? Who's looked at this problem in addition to you? Make sure that they're networking with other experts.
What would be another approach to the solution that you've given me? Those kind of questions have got to be there. Just test for solidity of the technical foundation. That's the whole deal.
Okay, I'd like to take a step back to your beginnings as an engineer. Why did you choose to be an engineer?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I started out at school as a physics major. And when I got there, I decided that was really going to be too theoretical. And so for me, engineering was the ability or the opportunity to practically solve problems, not do it in space or in theory.
What's a wave?
Yeah, but actually, go out and solve real problems. So I think for me, that's the essence of why I became engineer. Go do something, see the answer, see the result, get the feedback.
Yeah, we used to describe that as putting steel in the ground.
Right.
That sounds like an upstream response. For me, I loved math and science. Physics was great, and theoretical mathematics was great, and all that kind of stuff, and just couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to do with all that stuff. What I decided was I wanted to be able to build things. I wanted to, when I finished doing what I was doing, I wanted to be able to point at something and say, we've created something in this world, and engineering is that endeavor. So that's kind of how I grew into it.
Once you got into your careers as engineers, what did you like most about it?
I think the most exciting thing for me has been to pull together a group of diverse engineers and attack a problem and come up with a solution that surprises the client. In other words, geez, we never expected that. That's a lot better than we ever expected. So to kind of energize that group and get them to get innovative and bring out the best in each other, right? And so that's, to me, the most exciting, to go after something and come up with a solution that's better than anybody could have expected. That's what
It's hard to improve on that answer. The one thing you get in that answer is what's better. The thing I always enjoyed was you can do a lot of things, you can make a lot of things, but the question is, do the things you're making have value? So the better question, what I always enjoyed in engineering, is can you get to a solution that really, really does have value? And the teamwork, the technical challenges, all of the creativity is fantastic. When that solution has value to the world or value to us, then it's very enjoyable.
Well, let's flip that question around. We've talked a little bit about what you liked. What didn't you like about being an engineer?
Go.
Go.
I'll go. You want me to go? I'll go.
You go first.
I'm not sure it's about being an engineer that you don't like. I think it's the day-to-day work environment that we all do. You know, they pay us money to work. And there are times when you end up working for or with people that are just not very fun. And the politics, big word, but the politics of the business can become tedious and distracting and frustrating. A solution for it is just to get engaged and make that stuff better, but it's hard work, and that's why you get paid.
So sometimes there's a grind that
That's
you
a
just
little
have
bit
to
of a
push
grind,
through.
yeah. There's a grind.
Yeah. I think the other, you know, the answer is probably in the short is people, right?
Yeah.
But, you know.
Love them.
Right.
Not always.
Particularly when you get into a sort of a leadership position, at some point you're going to have to counsel somebody. And, you know, I don't know about you, Chuck, but as an engineer, you know, the reason I became an engineer was not because I wanted to do, you know, psychology and sociology and the soft skills. So sitting down with somebody and saying, you know, things aren't going right, you need to do better or behave better or whatever, that was always a draining experience.
The discipline side is never fun. To counsel someone for improvement when there's a positive side, you know, there's the two sides.
Right.
There's the good counseling and then the counseling that's discipline. Discipline's never fun. Just not fun to discipline people. It's just the way it is.
Well, let's extend that discussion now into your leadership and managerial roles. What did you like most about being a leader?
I think I'm going to kind of go back to the question, the earlier answer. I think the most exciting thing when you're leading a group is when the group's performance and the individuals feel like, you know, they're doing better than they were without you, right? So I think the most rewarding experience has been when you know, I've had people in my career come up and say, you know, I really enjoyed working with you. I felt like I've done the best I've done during this period, and you know, I'm going to miss you now that you're moving on. And so that's, to me, really gratifying. And I think that's the role of the leader, is really to facilitate everybody else being the best they can be.
Yeah. Yeah, if you break it down into leadership, management, and supervision being the counseling and discipline, management being, you know, what are we going to spend our money on when and how fast are we going to go, and then leadership, setting direction and empowering people clearly is just an enjoyable thing. Where are we going? We're going here. How are we going to get there? Well, you're going to take us. And empowering people to do that and letting them grow and be as strong as they can be, better than they think they can be, that's pretty exciting.
So what do you think might have been the biggest challenges that you faced as a leader?
You know, one of the big challenges I remember was at one point in my career, I was managing a pretty big project, and it was one of the early project management positions. And the first time I had to manage managers. Mm-hmm. And so that's a whole, you know, it's a big step change, because, you know, before you're managing a small group and they all are pretty much, you know, looking for leadership. And then all of a sudden, when you start to lead leaders, they, you know, the roles have to get defined better, and you're just moving that much further from the work, right? And that's always a challenge, because you're completely relying on these people to do the right thing and go in the right direction. And what I find is that when you're in that position, you have to convince them that you're going in the right direction.
This is the right way.
This is the right way, because if they don't believe it, they won't follow.
And they can be disruptive.
That's right.
Yeah, that's tough. I agree with all that. I'll take a technical tack. The challenging thing when you're a leader is if you are a member of a group of leaders that are trying to accomplish something, and the direction of the team, of the organization is not right. Having to stand up and change the direction can be extremely challenging. Rewarding, but extremely challenging. Standing on on your principles, standing on your values, standing on the technical merit, whatever the reason is that things aren't going in the right direction, moving a large organization off of the momentum path that they're on is truly challenging.
Well, again, as we did with the engineer question, let's flip it around and talk a little bit. What was your least favorite part of being a leader?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I think, you know, if you're in that leadership position and you enjoy it, I mean, there's a lot of people, I think, for me, I kind of went to work in the morning to make decisions and lead people. I mean, that's what I did. But I also knew people who, that was the hardest thing about coming to work, is that they were in charge, right? They didn't want to do it. So I think if it's something you want to do and you enjoy, even the hard parts are fun and they're a challenge, right? And if it's not a natural thing and it's something you're just there to do, and we all get in those positions where somebody asks us to do something we're not excited about, then that's probably the most, leading a task that you're not committed to is probably the hardest thing about being a leader.
Convincing yourself you're committed to it. I think for me, the hardest part, in a leadership role, you're responsible for the ethical, moral honesty of your organization. And when someone is not ethical, moral, or honest, and you have to discipline them, that's difficult. It's necessary, but you're right down there at the human interface level, and it can be very, very, very challenging. You have to do it, but it's difficult.
Yeah. So thinking back to how did you prepare to deal with those challenges? Was there anything in particular that you did in your personal development or preparation for those roles to be prepared to deal with those special challenges or difficulties?
Well, the discipline thing, I'll go first.
Good.
The discipline thing, the preparation is just do a gut check. Are the values that you are espousing for yourself and for the organization, for the whoever you're working with and for, are they consistent? You know, do they apply to everyone? And if this person that you're disciplining has gone outside of those set of values, be comfortable in your skin that in the discussion, in the discipline, in the correction, whatever it is that you're going to undertake in the disciplinary action, make sure you're comfortable that you're coming from a place that is strong and consistent.
You know, I completely agree with that. And what I found throughout my career is that I'd say training. You know, I took some courses and similar to this one that talk about how do you coach, how do you counsel,
Right.
What are the right mechanisms, and there's some things that you can, I think back to the point of always learning, you really just need to go out and figure out where your weaknesses are and seek some training around those things, because yes, it's difficult and you have to have the right moral compass, but then you also have to learn how to approach that problem.
How do you do it? Yeah.
Sure. Well, Chuck, from what you were saying, it sounds like it's really important that wherever you are, that your personal values need to align pretty closely with the corporate culture and values that you're working in. Otherwise, you're not going to be happy.
Yeah, it's stress. There are times when it won't. I think to the point of your values and the cultural values or corporate values, you need to understand both. And if there's a necessary reconciliation, seek that reconciliation and understand it. Generally, well, at least the corporation I work for, a huge corporation, had pretty consistent, you know, universal values that were aligned with mine. At times I had people within the organization that didn't have values aligned with mine, and I had to do some reconciliation. And that's not always easy, but it's necessary.
Challenge. As you look back at your experiences as leaders, what would you point to perhaps as the most important skills to have?
Jeez. People skills.
People skills?
Yeah.
That's good. I think also communication, because at some point, I mean, a key for me in terms of being a leader is creating a vision, communicating that vision, getting people to accept that you have a plan and that the vision makes sense, and then accepting to follow it, which all of that requires a whole raft of communication.
Yeah.
And being able to communicate. I mean, I've seen a lot of people that were very good at what they did, and they were excellent in terms of thinking and innovation, but they could not communicate or convince people that they had the answer.
Yeah, couldn't explain it.
And so I think that's probably a key skill.
Good point. That there's always two sides to communication. You know, convincing people that the direction you're going in is correct and explaining their work is all good. But the other side of listening to people, especially people who maybe not the best at explaining what they want to do, listening and pulling value out of what people can give you is critical. So it's, again, communication. Both sides.
I think the other thing is organization, being able to organize the group and put together a reasonable plan that people can understand and they can follow. I mean, we've all been around those charismatic leaders, right, that get up there and they make a great speech and you say, okay, now what are we going to do next? Well, I don't know, go figure it out. You know?
That's your job.
So is there anything in particular that you did to develop those communication skills?
Again, I think there are classes and courses out there that give you some techniques. It's a matter of really kind of getting out there and practicing and getting feedback. Right. During my career, I was lucky in that I had, at one point when I was leading a large group, I had some coaches that used to give me feedback every time I got up and did something.
That's nice.
And so that's, I think, getting those mentors and seeking that feedback on how you're doing, even if you're going to your subordinates and saying, did you understand what I was talking about? Then it's important.
Well, that brings up an interesting question. How did you go about providing feedback to your staff?
Daily. Never, I can't remember who it was. I think one of the great football coaches says, never miss an opportunity to coach. You've always got an opportunity to coach. And if
There's always that coachable minute.
Coachable minute, always. And that's daily. And then informal. You give a formal review. So let's schedule some time and talk and lay out kind of the dimensions that you're gonna be discussing, and ask them to think about it beforehand and follow up with the communication. It's just, I said it before, but there's really three things you do as leaders. You got leadership, management, and supervision. And supervision is the part where you're forming and helping people grow. And you just have to do it all the time, every day, in all different kinds of ways, from very informal to very formal.
I can't really add to it. I think it's just important that you take the time to just probably as much informally sit down with people and make sure that they know you have time.
Yeah.
I think one of the keys that I've found is that, and that people have taught me, is when somebody comes in to ask a question, take the time to set aside whatever you're doing and visit and understand what they're saying and take the time. I mean, people don't like to come get coached if you say, well, I'm busy right now, come back in 2 hours, right?
I'll be ready to coach
I'll
you.
schedule you.
One of the things that I found, quite frankly, was to go be in their workspace instead of mine,
right.
as a way of facilitating, providing some feedback.
It's that behavior, like Tom was saying, the behavior of making people important all the time, and individuals feeling that they're important. They are. You'll never do anything without people. Is key. So you just there are folks that you'll deal with in your life that think the technical side is the most important thing, and it's important. They think the money side is the most important. It's important, and the people side they kind of ignore. Well, all three of those things need to be right at the top, and people will understand. If you don't think they're important, they'll understand you don't think they're important.
I'll share with you a trick that the senior VP once told me that he did, and actually it had a huge impact on the teams that when you're leading a larger team where you multiple layers. He told me that he had a goal, and he actually measured that he spent 4 hours every week visiting or talking to somebody who did not report to him directly.
Yeah.
So I listened. I said, okay, I'm going to try this. And the impact of going around your direct reports and going and visit with the people, just out there in the team and sitting with them several times, all of a sudden, the whole group feels like, they're part of the game.
It's important.
And so that's something, that people, when they get into those, they start moving up where there's multiple layers. So I would challenge people, go out and spend time with, let's say, people you don't have to.
Yeah.
And they're going to help you, and you're going to help them.
Yeah. Check your message. Did your message get there?
Okay. I'd kind of like to approach a close here with one last question, and that is, given your experience looking at engineers over the last 30 plus years, what advice would you give to a new graduate engineer coming into industry who's contemplating moving into a leadership role? What kinds of things should they be thinking about, and how should they prepare for that opportunity?
The number one challenge I see today, and it's we talked about the change in technology, is that when I started my career, the only way to communicate with people is to walk around. The email and all that didn't exist. And today, I think the biggest challenge and the thing that people can do is get out from behind their computer and actually walk around and do what we're talking about. Sit down and visit with people and actually do the face-to-face, ask questions. I think one advice that the CEO of the company gave a young engineer like 2-3 months out of school was, he said, what can I do to get your job? And he told him, he says, do the best you can at your job and go out and learn as much about what the company does and what other people around you do. And that's the best thing you can do to prepare yourself. And I would agree with that. And part of that is you can't do that electronically. You have to go out and do that face to face.
Yeah, great answer. It's kind of a trite comment, but the advice I would give is don't look at the destination. Do the journey, do the work. Work hard, apply all the skills that you've gotten technically and from this course. I mean, the stuff that's in this course, you're going to learn all kinds of things about how to interact with others, but do the work. Do the work. Work hard, enjoy it, do the best you can at the tasks that are assigned you. Ask for more. See if there's more that you can do. Expand your responsibilities. Always go out and try to make new friends of all different types and understand how everybody interacts in the company, and just enjoy the journey. The destination will come to you. It'll come to you.
I think that's great advice, because that's what I tell people all the time is work on the skills that you want to have.
Yeah.
Don't aim for a position, because I know in my career, nobody could have charted the path that I took to get to where I got
If
to.
they would have been questioned.
There is no
Same.
standard path, and I guess what you're saying is consistent with what I've observed over time, is that if you're a good leader or you have the right skills to be a leader, the positions will find you. You don't have to go find them.
Yeah. Expand, what is it, the circle of influence?
Yes.
Continue to expand what you control in your circle of influence, and move into the circle of concern, and do a doggone good job of all of it, and things will find you.
Well, I'd like to wrap up now and start by saying thank you very much for taking time and for sharing your thoughts and your experiences. You combined over 70 years worth of
Scary.
engineer and leadership experience, but thank you for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This time we'll wrap up the module and move on. Thank you. Hello, today I'm coming to you from Rice University's Fondren Library. Fondren is the home of Rice's OpenStack library and is home as a prime study location for many of Rice's students. I'm currently standing in an alcove just off of the main entrance. Next to me is a podium that's a replica of the podium used by President John F. Kennedy during his September 1962 speech here on the Rice campus, where he delivered his famous Moon speech. This speech is a great example of how to take technical concepts and challenges and turn them into meaningful statements for the non-technical person. It also is a great example of how to provide an inspiring and motivational lesson for your followers. In that speech, Kennedy outlined his plans and his challenges for putting a man on the moon within 8 years of the time he delivered the speech. As you look at this speech, look for those examples that you will find re-emphasized in later portions of the certificate program. I hope that as you view the video, that you take those lessons and use them to think creatively and to act boldly as you pursue your leadership career. In my classrooms over the last few years, I've noticed that one of the greatest struggles that the students have is how do they allocate their time appropriately so that they can get all of their work done. So today I'd like to introduce a tool for you to use that I have found particularly helpful for myself. We're going to talk about time management, and this will be the tool for the module. I found that if you can do this effectively, if you can allocate time appropriately, it is one of the keys to eliminating stressors in your life. We will devote an entire module to how to manage stress, and a key theme that will come out of that is how do you handle budgeting your time. I like to say that time cannot be managed. Not even Einstein could manage time. What you can manage is your behavior. You manage your behavior to fit the time available. As you manage your behavior appropriately and allocate time to the most important things, then you will improve your efficiency and effectiveness. That's going to be especially important as we apply these tools to your goals and ultimately to the competencies within the leadership framework. How you prioritize your time is strongly influenced by what your values are. And for those of you that span different generations, you're going to find that those values are vastly different. We'll take some time later on in this course to talk about that. But now I'd like to introduce a concept that I learned many years ago. It comes from the works of Stephen Covey. It's a 2x2 matrix that plots importance versus urgency. This is a framework that you can use to see how you are spending your time. And once you have done that, figure out how to create more time to accomplish higher importance tasks. So let's look a little bit at what each of these boxes contains. Those activities that we call high urgency, high priority, these typically are crises in our lives, those things that need attention right now, and they are really important. These could be family matters, they could be professional or otherwise. You don't have much option on whether or not to devote time to this. This is non-discretionary time. Next are those activities that, while they're still important, don't have to be done right now. In this box, I like to put things like your development activities. The work that you will be doing on your leadership development plan clearly fits into this category. It's not urgent, but it's extremely important to you and to your future success. Planning activities also tend to fall in this box. Aren't urgent right now, but if you don't do them effectively, you will create that crisis later on down the road. In the high urgency, low importance box, email, text messages, phone calls, all tend to fall in here. They may or may not be extremely important, but they typically demand your attention and There's an expectation that you'll respond fairly quickly to these things. In the fourth box, these are the things that I call escapes. These are routine things that you might do that are neither productive or effective in your development. What kinds of things fit in here? My observation, particularly of my children, was that video games typically fall in here. And in your case, perhaps social networking or other activities that are great diversions but don't necessarily affect your performance. So what's a strategy for how do you allocate your time? My suggestion to you is that for a period of at least a week, use this matrix to categorize how you're spending your time. Figure out which box your activities fall into. If you can do that inventory, you'll begin to find that perhaps by eliminating some of those activities in that box number 4, you'll be able to squeeze some time to be available to the other 3 boxes. In the long term, I suggest to you that where you want to get the most benefit for your improvement is by creating time in that box number 2. That time that you can use to program your development activities, to plan future activities so that you can be more effective. We're going to find as we talk about stress later on, this is a key tool to enable you to reduce stress. I challenge you to do the weekly experiment, to categorize your time and find out where you can create more space in your schedule for the more important things in your life. Earlier in this lesson, I described the 4-quadrant approach to prioritizing the activities in your life. Over 30 years ago, I came across another way of doing that. I came across a description of a professor doing a demonstration in his class that is now, over the years, become called the Big Rocks approach to time prioritization. In his experiment, he described the time available for a person as being analogous to a jar. In that jar, we have to put those things in our life, whether they're very important, medium importance, or low importance. He described putting big rocks into the jar. I'm modeling those with golf balls here. And these would be the important things, your family, your friends, maybe your job. At this point, the professor asked, "Is the jar full?" And many of the students in the class responded, "Why, of course." He then pulled out a bag of pebbles and proceeded to fill the jar again. And the professor asked again, "Is the jar full?" Students are beginning to catch on at this point and realize that there was a lesson in mind. But there were still some students who thought that the jar wasn't full, so the professor pulled out some sand and proceeded to fill the jar once more. And again, he asked his students, "Is the jar full?" Now the students weren't quite sure what to say, but clearly they were beginning to catch on. The professor said, "Of course it's not full yet," whereupon he took out a glass of water and proceeded to fill the jar. At that point, he agreed that the jar was full, but I know that you, as scientists and engineers, would still recognize that at the molecular level, there's still mostly space inside this jar. His point was, though, that in order to make all of these things, the important things, the medium importance things, and the low importance things, in order to make them all fit in the time available, they had to be placed in the jar in the correct order. I'll demonstrate now what happens when you don't put them in the right order. Now that we've seen what it looks like to put the big rocks in first, let's see what happens if we start filling our lives with the less important stuff first. What if I fill the jar with the sand first? And then I add the pebbles, the medium important stuff in our lives. and then try to put in as many of the big things as I can. And what we see is that very quickly there's no longer space for the big important things in our lives. The lesson here is that unless you put the big rocks in first, you won't have space for all of the things that you would like to accomplish in your lives. So whether you use the four-quadrant approach or the big rocks approach, it's up to you. However, one of those two techniques ought to help guide you in determining what things are most important in your life. Good luck as you make your prioritization decisions. We're coming to you again from the Hindman Garden here on the Rice campus. As I think about the context of Module 2, what comes to my mind is the rapid pace of technology change over the last century. As I reflect back on my first job at Shell, which I started in 1981, I had responsibility for designing and building a pilot plant. In those days, the process control was all pneumatic, meaning we used instrument air to control the valves. We had analog measurements. When we wanted to record data, the experimentalist or technician had to go out to the unit and read dials and gauges. Within a couple of years later, I was working on a different pilot plant, and by that time we had evolved to single-loop electronic controllers. We had begun to do some automated data collection, and data logging allowed us to collect data as frequently as about every 10 minutes instead of once an hour as we were doing previously. Within 10 years of the time that I started, we had implemented distributed control systems. We were beginning to use analog instrumentation, and we could record measurements as frequently as a few seconds apart. As I begin to look at where we've come even in the last few years, we're evolving to wireless technologies where we can send telemetry data on process units or other things that we want to measure via GPS and satellite. That pace of change is enormous, and I've seen that just in my own fairly brief career. So I ask you, what do you think is in store for you as you approach the future? Now that we've completed the demonstration on how to prioritize your time, it's time to take a look at the second half of my leadership observation. You recall from the beginning we talked about leaders never stop learning. Well, if you happen to come across one that has, check his pulse. They're probably dead. Now it's time to summarize what we've learned in this module. We spent a good deal of time talking about the National Academy of Engineering article, Engineer of 2020. The information in this pamphlet highlights those challenges that you will be faced with as you continue to grow and develop as not just an engineer, but as an engineering leader. We did the technology timeline, which emphasized the rapid pace of change and the exponential growth and change that you are likely to experience as a practicing engineer. This particular topic ties very closely to the lifelong learning competency from the RSEL Leadership Framework. We had an opportunity to view the Kennedy speech. What's remarkable about this speech is that it was delivered in 1962, well before the Engineer of 2020 article. It's a great example of how you can communicate an engineering vision to those who are not technically oriented. You'll have an opportunity in the communications course to spend much more time on how to create that vision. We talked about prioritizing your time, ways of squeezing unproductive, low urgency, low importance activities to make available time for the other important things in your life. We did the big rock demonstration as a way of visualizing how that works. Remember the challenge that I posed to you about prioritizing your time. Over the next week, categorize your time in each of those 4 boxes of the Covey framework. Figure out which of those activities you can squeeze out to make more time available in the other boxes so that you can become more effective. Welcome to the third module in our self-awareness course. In this module, we're going to take a much deeper dive into self-awareness. But first, let's take a look at my leadership observation for the day. Leadership is like driving a Mack truck rather than a Ferrari. I want you to hold that thought, and we'll return to it at the end of the module. Now let's take a look at the objectives for this module. We're going to take a very, very deep dive into a variety of self-assessments that you can do to help you gain better self-awareness. We'll spend some time understanding your motivation to lead. What is it that drives you to want to lead and to accept a leadership role? We'll spend additional time developing a personal vision. What is it that you seek to achieve as a leader and as an engineer? Lastly, we'll take some time to learn how to analyze some case studies that we'll be using throughout the remainder of this course and in our subsequent courses in this specialization. I would now like to reflect a little bit on self-awareness. We have this quote from ancient Greece, well known, know thyself. Also from ancient Rome, it matters not what you are thought to be, but what you are. That has meaning on a variety of levels. But a thought that I'd like to leave you with is, what you think you are isn't necessarily what you actually are. As we progress on our journey of leadership development, it's useful to have a roadmap to guide our endeavors. So let's begin with the hierarchy of life skills, and in particular, self-awareness, which lies at its core. Overlaid on top of self-awareness is goal setting and setting priorities, and we discussed this in some detail in our last module, and we'll come back to it later on in this specialization. You will recall from the last module that I talked about time management. I've taken the liberty here of substituting managing behavior for managing time to re-emphasize the point, you can't manage time, you can only manage your behavior. Overlaid on top of these core elements is managing stress. How you use stress or deal with stress will have a significant impact on how effective your leadership is. We call this the hierarchy of life management skills. I'm going to go back and look at each of these in much more detail, beginning with self-awareness. So what is self-awareness? It is that knowledge that we possess about ourselves that is essential for our growth. Why is this important to leaders? If you don't understand or have a good awareness of yourself, your attitudes, your motivations, then it's hard to make changes and adjustments that will improve your effectiveness. However, it's important to realize all of us like to receive positive information, but there is some information that we are resistant to hearing. In order to be effective, we need both categories. That information that is consistent with our self-image, we readily accept. However, we tend to avoid that which isn't consistent with our self-image. We need both, and we're going to take a little time now to examine the concept of the sensitive line. What happens when we as individuals receive information that isn't consistent with our self-knowledge? We have some options. When we reach that line, there may be a tendency to respond in an emotional way, particularly when that information is not consistent with our own self-image. We may feel pressure or tension. We may respond with a stress response. We call the negative response to receiving information inconsistent with our self-image the threat rigidity response. This may feel like stress, tension, your heart rate may go up, your breathing might increase, but what I've experienced is that those leaders that are most effective are those that can push that sensitive line further and further out so that they are capable of receiving information that's not consistent with their self-image, analyze that information, and then act appropriately to validate it, invalidate it, and then adjust their own leadership development plans. So how do we develop and validate our self-knowledge? What are the tools that are out there for us? Well, first of all, we need to seek that information out. We need to seek it from others. Part of your assignment in this course is to ask for supplemental feedback from others who have seen you in a leadership role. Another way is to self-disclose and get feedback from others as you do that. Share information about yourself. In that vein, through this course and the remainder of our specialization together, I will share information about myself as a basis for comparison and also to share how I have adjusted my leadership development to accommodate various aspects of self-awareness. The tools that are available to us are a variety of self-assessments that are in the text. You've already received those, and we will want to complete all of those before we proceed to the other lessons in this module. So what are the components of self-awareness that we'll be dealing with? Let's begin with core self-evaluation. This is composed of several elements, but it all relates to self-esteem. It includes locus of control, self-efficacy, and others that we're going to spend much more time talking about. What are your values? Your values will influence your behavior and the way you make decisions. We'll spend some time in another module to talk about how you assess your values. How you learn new things is going to be important to your leadership development. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what is your learning style. How do you adjust to change? As was clear in our second module when we talked about the engineer of 2020, change is inevitable in the engineering profession. Not only is it inevitable, but it will be rapid and increasing. We must have a way to adjust to change and adapt. How well do you deal with others? How do you tune in to the emotional level of your team or the emotional state of others? Your ability to do that and adjust your behavior appropriately will be a key to your success as a leader. Let's take some time now to look at the role of personality as it relates to leadership success. As we talked about earlier, personality is a set of stable attributes formed early in life, but develop some over time. In this course, we're using two personality assessments. One is the Big Five, based on a large body of academic research, but we'll also occasionally refer to the Myers-Briggs personality assessment. For now, let's take a closer look at the Big Five. The first domain out of the Big Five is extroversion. As I pointed out earlier, the scale, the number scale of the assessment that you did has no particular meaning in and of itself. All it is intended to do is show a tendency towards one end of the domain versus the other. There's no average or good or bad associated with the number scale. As we look at extroversion, at the high end of that scale, we see those people that derive their energy from being in a group setting. They tend to be very sociable and outgoing. However, they can be perceived as acting before thinking or even steamrolling the introverts in the group. As we look at the introverts, what we see are those people who derive their energy from being alone or certainly have to devote a great deal of energy to be in a group setting. They can be perceived as being aloof or distant. However, what you'll notice in a team setting is that the introvert is typically the one who's thought through multiple times what they're going to say. So my suggestion for the extroverts is when you see the introvert being quiet, it's an opportunity to ask them their thoughts. Moving on to the agreeableness scale. This typically refers to those people who avoid conflict. As we see at the agreeable end of the scale, these are people who value harmony. They're empathetic. However, they can be perceived as being inconsistent and avoiding conflict in circumstances where it would actually be beneficial for the group. At the low end of the scale, it's not so much being disagreeable, but it's being a willingness to engage in conflict where it is useful. However, the drawbacks at this end of the scale is that you can be perceived to be excessively competitive. My experience is that among the engineers that I've had in the classroom, they tend to fall at the higher end of this scale. As we move to the conscientiousness scale, what we see is that individuals who fall at the high end of this scale tend to be very detail-oriented. They tend to want to deliver results. That has some potential negative consequences in that they can become micromanagers. They can, in many circumstances, not be willing to trust those in the team to deliver results. As we begin to look at the low end of this scale, what we see are those individuals who aren't as responsive under pressure, who tend to prefer less structure. They can be prone to procrastination, and their spontaneity can create stress within the group. My own experience in observing engineers in the classroom is that they tend to fall at the higher end of this scale. My experience has been that most of the engineers I've seen tend to be at the high end of that conscientiousness scale. They wouldn't be where they are if they weren't conscientious. When we move on to the neuroticism scale, again, this refers to how do you respond emotionally to the circumstances around you. Those at the higher end tend to have a much more emotional response to what happens around them. They are prone to worry and they are prone to anxiety. That can have negative consequences in the team setting when that anxiety is seen and experienced by other members of the group. Those at the lower end of the spectrum tend to be calm under pressure and are perceived to be even-tempered. However, the negative consequence can be that they are too laid back and are not ready to take action when action is needed. Moving on to the openness to experience domain, we see individuals at the upper end of this scale tend to be non-conforming, very creative, and that can be a benefit in a team setting. However, they also tend to not want to follow the rules, and that can have negative consequences. As we move to the lower end of the scale, here's where we typically see engineers who tend to be down to earth and very practical in their approach. The negative consequence of that is that they can be too focused on the here and now and be too absorbed in the analysis of the problem, too focused on the details of the problem and not able to see the big picture. So as we move to these 5 domains that you're going to do in your personality assessment, what I would like for you to focus on is how do each of these domains affect your personal leadership style? What are the things that you have to consider in either your development or how you consciously behave as a leader to either leverage a personality trait or to cope with aspects of it that don't contribute to effective leadership style? In that vein, I'd like to share with you my own results and some insights from my own experiences as a leader. As I start with the extroversion category, what you see here is that I am at the lower end. I would be considered an introvert. Throughout my experience as both a military officer and as a manager in the industrial environment, I found that there were times I had to consciously behave in a more extroverted manner in order to be effective. I had to overcome my tendency to want to be an introvert. On the agreeableness scale, I tended to want to preserve harmony and avoid conflict. And I found that in most of the team settings that I was in, particularly in industry, that proved to be an effective strategy in delivering results. I fall high on the conscientiousness scale. I didn't get where I am as a military leader or as an engineer without being conscientious and delivering results. Ultimately, as engineers, that's one of the things that you will have to deal with. If you happen to fall at the low end of this scale, you may want to devote some thought to how can you add more structure to the way you work in order to become more effective. In my case, I fall at the low end of the neuroticism scale. What that ended up for me in a positive way was that I was able to stay calm in circumstances where it was a crisis. That was a benefit both in my military and in my engineering careers where I could deal with pressure when others were not able to do so. On the openness to experience category, you see I fall typically where other engineers do, tends towards the lower end. I tend to be very practical, very well grounded, and I tend to follow the rules and be more conforming than non-conforming. So as you look at your results, you may want to take a similar view as to how each of those domains affect your leadership style and what conscious decisions might you want to make to behave differently to be effective when needed. Within the body of academic research on success and happiness and what factors that we've been reviewing correlate to those, an area that stands out is core self-evaluation. Core self-evaluation is composed of 4 domains, each of which we'll examine in a little bit more detail, one of which we already have explored earlier in our lesson. First among these, self-esteem. How do you feel about yourself? Do you feel okay? If your self-esteem is high, that contributes to success and probability of happiness. Do you feel you have the skills and ability to do the job? That's generalized self-efficacy. If you believe you do, then your probability of success goes up. Neuroticism. As we talked earlier very briefly about personality, and as we'll discuss a little bit later, your ability to stay calm in pressure situations can have a significant positive impact on your success. If you respond emotionally, that could have a negative consequence when it comes to job satisfaction and success. And lastly, locus of control, as we described earlier, has a significant impact on whether you feel empowered and in control of those factors that you need to be successful. I'd like now, as I did before with locus of control, to share some of my own results. As I took the self-assessment for core self-evaluation, my results ended up being a number of 4, which puts me in roughly the 3rd quartile. That suggests that overall, I have a positive self-regard that enables me to enjoy success and to be happy in those endeavors that I undertake. My suspicion is the reason it is not a little bit higher is that as I approach new and more challenging activities, I tend to have a little bit of nervousness about whether or not I can accomplish those. And that's probably also reflected in my openness to experience category in the Big 5 that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now I'd like to examine locus of control in a little more detail. You recall from the core self-evaluation that locus of control is one of those elements that correlates to happiness and success. But it is the attitude that people develop regarding themselves and feeling whether they're in control of their circumstances and their surroundings. As we look at the components, it's worth knowing or recognizing that where you are on the spectrum of internal to external locus of control is situationally dependent. It could vary based on your experience, about the role that you're in, or the particular problems that you're faced. So understand that as you do the self-assessment and as you look at this area, that it could vary quite a bit over time. As I say, it is situation specific. Don't be surprised if there are circumstances in which you find yourself more in control than other circumstances where you feel less in control. That might be particularly relevant as you approach a new job, a new role. That would be a circumstance where you might likely feel a more external locus of control. Once you've gained experience, confidence in your role, that locus of control will shift more towards internal. Different people have different locus of control depending on their experiences and the extent to which they feel in control of their lives. Recognize that locus of control will change with time and, as I said before, with the circumstances in which you find yourself. I'd like now to look at a model of how you might want to build an internal locus of control. Within the North American culture, having an internal locus of control correlates more highly with success in a leadership role. So I will encourage you, as you develop your plans, to look at ways that you can build your internal locus of control. Let's look at a model of locus of control in which these are the factors that might contribute to your success. First are those items that are within your control, that you know that you can control. Outside of this are those things that you can influence. They're not directly within your control, but you can influence those to ensure success. Then there's a realm of factors that are of interest, are of concern, but you do not either directly control them or influence those. There's even an area outside of that of factors that you may not even be aware of, things that you don't know. There could be elements of each of these four areas that contribute to your success. Within our model here, what we would like to do is expand the circle of control and the circle of influence, those things that you feel confident about influencing to ensure your success. If you had an external locus of control, the pressures that you feel will tend to shrink your circle of influence over time, and that in turn will reduce your effectiveness. You'll feel less in control, less able to influence the outcomes of those things that are going on around you. Now let's take a look at developing an internal locus of control. As I mentioned before, in the North American culture, internal locus of control correlates most highly with successful leadership outcomes. Our focus here is to grow the circle of influence. The broader that you can grow that, the more likely you'll be able to expand not just your circle of concern, but also the circle of control as well. So we'll be looking at things to grow that circle of influence. How might you do that? Experience, continued learning, taking on challenging assignments, all are things that might help you grow that circle of influence and thereby expand all of those areas that are going to help you be successful in leadership. Now let's examine the self-awareness assessment that you did on the locus of control area. You will find that the results fall along a scale of 0 to 10, with the median being about 5. Thus, if your score is above 5, that suggests that you have an external locus of control. So we would like to be moving down this scale as we expand that area of influence, that circle of influence, to a more internal locus of control near the bottom of this scale. As I did before in the cognitive style and in the core self-assessment, I'll share my results with you. At the time I took this particular assessment, my result was a 3, suggesting that I have a fairly strong internal locus of control. Before we launch off into a detailed discussion of personality, it's worthwhile taking a moment to reflect on what influences behavior. As we look at the sum of all of our characteristics that influence behavior, these are the 4 factors that dominate. First, personality, formed early in our lives, growing through puberty and young adulthood, but remaining fairly stable through time. Values also formed fairly early, but they can evolve much more so than personality. Attitudes and moods, on the other hand, can be highly variable and change depending on the circumstances. So as we look at this on a stability scale, we would say that personality, fairly stable over time, moods, much more changeable. The collection of all of these are what constitute our behavior. As we think about these, something to consider is that you can choose, through appropriate use of analytical and creative problem-solving techniques, to behave in ways contrary to one of these for the benefit of you, for your team, and to ensure effective outcomes. Now that you've had an opportunity to take a number of self-assessments, let's begin our discussion by looking at cognitive styles. This refers to how we gather information, how we analyze it, but I should emphasize that it is not necessarily driven by personality, but can be a learned behavior. We're going to look at 3 styles overall, some of which you are probably already familiar with. The knowing style, characteristic of dealing with facts, figures, details, analyzing data. These are all things that you're probably already very familiar with, and it wouldn't surprise me if the knowing style is your dominant style. However, as you grow as a leader, you may need to develop skills in the planning style, which emphasizes agendas, fixed agendas, detailed plans, preparation for activities. This is going to be extremely important as you begin to supervise teams and groups. However, another style is the creating style, which is going to be extremely important as you begin to analyze problems for which there's no one set answer. Those situations where there's ambiguity, where you may need to think a little bit differently, and especially where you may need to draw on the input from other people. As you learn and grow as a leader, you will want to adapt your style, your cognitive style, to the particular situation. You may have to learn how to do that, and we'll spend some time later on in your leadership development plan talking about that. By now, you've started doing the self-assessments that we've assigned as part of this course. As we go through the entire course, you'll be taking a number of self-assessments. As we do that, I will try to correlate those to the specific leadership skills and competencies that are within the leadership framework. I'll also, at the same time, share my own results and give you some insights as to how I think those results correlate to my leadership experiences and to some of my success as a leader. As we look at each of the 3 cognitive styles, as you assess your own results, you'll find that they fall on a scale of about 0 to 10. On this scale, typical values are about 4. What you should notice is that there will be a dominant style that then would be a high score on any of these scales. What this represents is your inclination as to how you process and act on information, what your habitual approach or default approach might be to dealing with problems that you're solving. As I look at my own results, my results for all 3 of these categories were in the 9 to 10 range, significantly outside the standard deviation and well above the average. I feel that that's a reflection of some of the experiences that I've had as a leader. That cognitive style can change a bit over time. As I look at my own experience, that knowing side correlates most strongly with my experiences as an engineer. You get to be an engineer by knowing a lot of things. Having had that experience, I think is reflected in a fairly high score for knowing in my case. As far as the planning part, I had a fairly long military career, and one of the highlights of that is doing a lot of planning. It's an essential element of rising to senior levels in the military. So I think that is reflected in the high score that I got in the planning area. I spent 34 years in the research and development area, and as a result, I think that creativity one also got some attention during that time, and I was able to grow that cognitive style to adapt to the situation. So the takeaway lesson for me is that depending on the role that you're in, you have an opportunity to develop one of these styles more or less, even though you might have an inclination to default to one or another. As we approach the end of this module, I'd like to take some time to talk about the Peter Drucker article that you were assigned to read. This article is a nice summary of many of the lessons that we addressed in this module. As you reflect on this article, I'd like for you to think about, do you know the answer to the questions that he posed? Do you have a plan to deal with those answers? Let's take these one at a time. In his article, he talked about knowing your strengths. Do you know what your strengths are? Why is that important? Drucker suggests that as you develop your plan for improving your leadership skills, one of the things that you must not forget are your strengths. There's a tendency in development plans to think about addressing weaknesses. If you only do that, you'll miss the opportunity to leverage your strengths? How do you perform? Do you know? How do you get feedback? And how do you assess your own performance? If you don't have tools for that, you'll need to develop them. Are there any particular aspects of your performance that are hindering your effectiveness? Do you know what they are? How can you get those? Who can you trust to tell you those things that are hindering your performance? As you grow, you're going to want to develop those mentors that will help you analyze your performance and assess where those weaknesses may be. Where can you contribute the best? Where do you fit in? Not all of us will fit in every particular role. Understanding what environment where you work most effectively will be critical, because those are the environments that you want to seek to leverage success. Finding out where you belong, what work environment, what people, what kinds of work that you want to do will be very, very critical. Leveraging success is a key theme throughout the Drucker article. What are your values? What's important to you? In the context of an engineer, this may be, what is the corporate culture in which you work? Understanding that culture and understanding that your values are consistent with that culture will be extremely important to your attitude and how you choose to contribute. How do you feel about developing the relationships in your world? How do you take ownership for those and act in proactive ways that will help grow more effective relationships? And lastly, do you have a plan for the rest of your life? Drucker suggests that if all you have in your life is your engineering profession and don't develop other interests, when the time comes to end that profession, you will be at a loss for what to do with the remainder of your life. Welcome to the Leadership Tools segment for this module. You've just had an opportunity to review the Adam Leipzig video where he discusses how to create a statement of your life purpose. I would like for you to go back and take a second look at that video, and as you do, be prepared to write your own statement of life purpose. Remember to cover the 5 steps: who you are, what do you do, who do you do it for, what do they want or need, and how do they benefit. I've found that having a good statement of life purpose represents the best first step for creating an actionable and useful leadership development plan that you'll do later in this specialization. If you would like to see a good example of that, I refer you back to the Meet the Professor video that I did earlier. At the end of that video, I give you my statement of life purpose. And as a challenge for this week, I would like for you to take that how do they benefit statement and use that when you are asked the question, what do you do? Here we are again at the Heinemann Garden for my journal reflection for this module. During my military career, I was a battalion commander, and one of my responsibilities in that role was to make sure that our units were trained, both my headquarters and our subordinate units. So frequently, we would travel from our home location to a military installation where we could go to the field and do our tactical training. I had developed a pretty good relationship with my staff, and my executive officer at the time was fond of ambushing our main convoy when he would be on the advance party doing our reconnaissance of our command post location. So frequently I had to worry about contending with a tactical environment where he was operating an ambush. On one particular exercise, I had sent him with an advance party to scout out where we were going to be setting up our operating area. And I knew from the terrain, I'd been on it many times, that there was only one place where he could conduct an ambush of our convoy as we approached our tactical site. Thinking on that, I decided to do something different. We had always used the same assembly area, and we'd always used the same entrance to the military installation. So on this particular occasion, I decided that I would test his assumption that we would be using that route by taking a different route into the field location. So I went in a different gate. And by the time he realized what had happened, I had already occupied our tactical area and was set up and ready to go. Needless to say, he was a little bit upset that we had fooled him and highlighted the fact that he had made an assumption about what we would do. So my challenge to you as you approach your career is, are you aware of the assumptions that you're making and the potential consequences that they might have? Congratulations, you've now completed Module 3, Self-Awareness. Before we finish the module completely, I want to refer back to my leadership observations. You'll recall from the beginning of the module that I mentioned that leadership is like driving a Mack truck rather than a Ferrari. The second half of that observation is, it has momentum, and if you oversteer it, you can easily lose control. I've seen many managers over my years of experience who micromanage and overmanage their organizations, and as a result, create chaos. Now let's take a look at the topics that we covered in this module. You'll recall from the beginning that we talked about the hierarchy of life management skills. And you should remember the point that I made about describing time management as behavior management instead. We then covered a number of self-assessments that you'll be doing during the course of this specialization, beginning with cognitive style. Remember the knowing, planning, and creative styles. This particular assessment is linked very strongly to the leadership competency framework of lifelong learning. We then talked about locus of control, and that leaders, as they grow, will want to develop a more internal locus of control. This particular assessment is linked very strongly to managing stress that we'll talk about in a later module. The core self-evaluation refers to your overall sense of value and self-esteem and correlates very strongly to your success and happiness in leadership roles. This particular self-assessment links very strongly to the competency of developing self-awareness. We then talked about personality assessments and how personality might contribute or hinder your progress as a leader. I shared with you my own example and how that impacted my success as a leader. We talked about the Peter Drucker reading, Managing Oneself. Here, this particular reading is packed with ideas on how you can develop a better internal locus of control, or conversely, expand your circle of concern and circle of influence. Lastly, we finished with the statement of life purpose, and my challenge to you to use that how do they benefit statement as your elevator speech. Welcome to Module 4. You'll recall from Module 3, we talked about the hierarchy of life skills. At the core of those skills was self-awareness, which was the entire theme of that module. The next layer out was setting goals, which we talked about in Module 1. Next out was managing time, which you'll recall I refer to as managing behavior. The outer shell of that concept for hierarchy of life skills is managing stress, and that will be the theme for today's module. But first, as always, let's review my observations on leadership. For today, good leaders always study other leaders to figure out those things that they want to replicate in their own leadership style and development. So here are our objectives for today. First, recognizing those things that cause stress in our environment. Second, understanding how that stress affects us as we go about trying to accomplish our tasks. Understanding the type A personality, a personality type that is prominent in our workplace. And lastly, and most importantly for you, is how will you deal with stress and channel it effectively or deal with it to improve your effectiveness as a leader. Before we move forward to our discussion of stress, let's take some time to talk about motivation to lead. You'll recall in Module 1 my observation about leadership. Understanding why you want to lead is an important first step on your leadership journey. So let's take some time to look at motivation to lead. First and foremost, understanding why you want to lead is an extremely important step to improving your success as a leader. There are a variety of contributing factors to your success as a leader. We're going to review an academic article in which a variety of factors were considered, investigated, and correlated to those factors that most influence success in leadership. We will examine some of those now. First was self-efficacy. Your belief in yourself as a leader is a strong, positive, correlating factor in your success. If you believe you can do it, your chances of success are greater. The fact that you've done something before gives you confidence in your ability to do it again. So past experience also tends to correlate very positively to your success as a leader. This suggests to me that you ought to look for those opportunities to lead so that you can build that experience that will contribute to future leadership experiences. Your personality, as we've discussed all along, also has an impact on your success as a leader. What are those things in your personality that either reinforce or that you will have to compensate for that will affect your success as a leader? And finally, values, as we've discussed before, influence your decision-making skills. As such, they have a dramatic impact on your leadership effectiveness. In a moment, we'll explore in much more detail each of the factors that contribute to not only your motivation to lead, but your success as a leader. Now let's begin our discussion of stress. There is a very strong linkage between leadership and stress, as you might expect. The Center for Creative Leadership has indicated that there is a very strong relationship between stress and leadership. Not a surprise in my mind. When you think about it, leaders are accountable for the behavior of others. Many times that is outside the range of control. Not surprising that the behavior of others might influence your stress levels. Stressful situations, crises, emergencies can in fact lead to the development of leaders. We've all heard of the emergent leader who arises out of a crisis. But stress isn't inherently negative. All of us use stress to drive us to accomplish certain things. Later on in this module, we'll examine an alternative view on stress. However, stress can lead to failure if you don't have the proper tools and techniques to help you cope and deal with stressful situations. You may fail. Now let's consider a model of stress. Kurt Lewin introduced the concept of the force field as a way of describing stress. It includes driving forces, restraining forces, and resiliency as a way of describing the interaction of all the forces related to stress. I kind of like to capture this theory in the form of a balloon. When you can think of the pressure on the inside of the balloon as the driving forces for stress. What might some of those driving forces be? Think about that. The outside would be the restraining forces. The atmospheric pressure pushing back on those driving forces helps keep them in check and in balance. The elasticity of the balloon represents resiliency, those skills that you might have to build resiliency in keeping those driving forces in check. The other part of this model that I like is that as the driving forces get larger or greater, you can imagine the balloon growing larger and larger and larger until the elasticity, the resiliency in the membrane is no longer sufficient to contain the forces. What might happen under those circumstances, I think you can imagine. It also has the benefit of reflecting on ways that we can develop strategies for reducing stress. How can we let some of the air out of the balloon so that that stress is diminished? We're going to talk about some of those strategies later on in the module. So with that in mind, let me leave you with this thought. Let's continue our discussion with a review of how we respond to stress. Typically, we go through two stages. The first is what we call the alarm stage, and this is where you feel anxiety, respiration rate increases, heart rate increases, the typical physiological responses to stress. If the stress persists, we then move into a response phase, a resistance stage where we may use certain defense mechanisms. We may use these in combination or individually, depending on our prior experiences in dealing with stress. Let's take a look at these one at a time. First might be aggression. You might actually attack the source of the stress, throw things or break things. I'm sure you've seen examples of that. You could also experience what we call regression. This would be resorting to a behavior that has worked for you in the past in helping to deal with stress. You might repress your feelings about the stress and ignore it and suppress those within yourself. You might experience withdrawal. How many of you have taken on an outside activity to divert your attention from a stressful situation? You may experience a fixation response, where you continue to repeat the behavior in an attempt to eliminate the stress. The example is repeatedly dialing the phone number when you're not getting a response at the other end. If stress persists for a long period of time and any of these defense mechanisms are not successful in reducing the stress, then you can experience exhaustion. This is the most dangerous phase of your response to stress, in that it can result in both physiological and emotional long-term effects and damage. Let's begin now our discussion of how we might actually manage stress in our lives. But first, let's take a look at a model of stress management. As we look at these potential stressors in our lives, they tend to fit in one of four categories. Anticipatory stresses. We can actually imagine things that are going to happen that could be negative, that will cause us anxiety and develop physiological and emotional responses, much as a real stressful situation might. There can be encounter stresses. Encounter stresses typically refer to those that are a result of interactions with other people. Time stressors. Almost all of us have experienced the pressures of having work overload and too many things to do and not enough time to do it. Situational stressors are a result of the environment. They could be work conditions or other factors related to the environment that can cause you stress. So given that most stressors fall into these categories, how might we respond to those? We already talked a little bit about potential reactions and defense mechanisms. But your response can be both physiological and psychological. We talked about experiencing anxiety, heart rate, perspiration, and some potential long-term effects leading to illness and sickness that can be a result of sustained stress. With this picture in mind, let's now devote some attention to how we might build resiliency that will moderate the effects of those stressors on us both physically and psychologically. This resiliency can be physical. We will want to develop ways of improving our conditioning so that our physical response can be managed and controlled. We'll want to devote some attention to how we build psychological and social resiliency so that in our interactions with others, we develop the right tools for coping. These together then will form the basis for the stress management strategies that we may choose to employ. Now let's take a quick look at those. These tend to fall into three broad categories: enactive, proactive, and reactive strategies. We're going to take a little bit more focused look at these now. As we look at inactive strategies, this really is an approach where you remove the stressor from your life entirely. This is not always possible, but it does have certain advantages over the other approaches. As we look at proactive strategies, here we're talking about developing resiliency. So things like physical conditioning would fall into a proactive strategy. It's something that you do over a long period of time to have longer-term benefits. Reactive strategies are going to be those that you cope with right now. What things can you do right now to deal with the stress in a particular situation? So these we call coping mechanisms. What are the effects of these? Well, as I mentioned in the inactive strategy, by removing the stressor from your life, that tends to be a more permanent solution. The proactive strategies, I mentioned physical conditioning, these tend to be longer-term strategies for coping with stress. The reactive ones, obviously, in the very short term, right now. As we look at the time frame for doing these, inactive strategies may take a long time to actually put in place. It may take time to remove that particular stressor from your life. Proactive strategies, moderate time frames, and the reactive ones tend to be very immediate. An effective overall approach to managing stress will employ a mixture of these three strategies. No one strategy alone is going to work. In order to be effective, you're going to have to employ them all. So think about the inactive strategies of removing stressors, the proactive ones of building resilience both in physical and emotional terms, and then what are those short-term coping mechanisms that you can put in place now to help you deal with those immediate, short-term, reactive situations. Back again at the Heinemann Garden for this module's reflection on journaling. Today I'm going to pick an example from my Boy Scout experience where I was on a 12-day trek to the Boy Scouts Philmont Scout Ranch in northern New Mexico. It's a location that's in the mountains, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of north central New Mexico. And so it's at high elevation in the Rocky Mountains. As I and our crew, composed of 8 scouts and 4 adults, prepared for that, we knew it was going to be extremely challenging, both physically and mentally. We were going to have a trek that was going to last 11 days on the trail. We were going to be carrying packs weighing over 50 pounds. We were going to be hiking at elevations up to 12,000 feet or above, slightly above. That's high stress. And we knew that we would be stressed both physically and emotionally as we did that trek. So we didn't take it lightly, and we prepared. As much as a year ahead of time, we began our physical conditioning. We practiced doing the various things that we would have to do together on the trail together, cooking, setting up and taking down our equipment, doing all of those things so that by the time we reached our trek, it would be routine. Fortunately for us, that preparation paid off. While it was stressful and while we did experience those challenges, we were able to cope with those both physically and emotionally and survive that trek, completing a trek in 11 days of about 90 miles. So my challenge to you is, what can you be doing now that's going to help reduce stress 6 months from now? Now that we've reviewed the strategies for dealing with stress, I'd like to give you an approach that you can put in your leadership toolkit that will help you develop your approach in specific stressful situations. I think the first step is recognizing when you're experiencing stress, understanding what the source is and how you're responding to it. Next, I think you need to analyze that source of stress, as well as how you're responding and what things that you're currently doing that are helping you to cope with that stress. From that, then you can develop an appropriate strategy. Pick from one of the inactive, proactive, or reactive strategies that will help you deal with that stress. In that vein, you might want to think about some specific things like deep breathing exercises for reactive strategies, or developing an exercise program as a proactive strategy, or even changing your environment as an inactive strategy for dealing with the stress. Having that right strategy then will allow you to test it and see how well it works in your particular circumstances. Find out what works, what doesn't work, discard, and what does, keep that in your inventory. And lastly, practicing your strategy in stressful situations will be extremely important. As we said before, particularly in the Motivation to Lead segment, we talked about building self-efficacy. The more you practice, the better your confidence will be in dealing with stress. Congratulations, we've now reached the end of our 4th module covering stress management. It's now time for my leadership observation for the module. You'll recall from the beginning that I talked about good leaders study other leaders to figure out what works for them and the things that they should emulate. But more importantly, they also figure out those things that they should not emulate. I know from my own experience, I saw many situations where I saw things that I promised myself I would never do if I were ever in a leadership position. Let's take a look at the topics that we covered in this module. We talked about motivation to lead. I think it's fundamentally important that all of us as leaders understand why we wish to lead as a way of developing future plans for our success. We talked about the physiological effects of stress, how it affects us and our bodies as we react to those stressors in our lives, and the fact that it can be a potentially dangerous situation for leaders if they don't deal with it effectively. We talked about some strategies for dealing with stress, the inactive, proactive, and reactive strategies that you may choose to use in some combination to deal with the stressors in your life. And lastly, I gave you a tool, a methodology for how you might actually employ those strategies as you develop an approach to managing the stress in your lives. Hopefully, as you manage stress, you will figure out ways to reduce its effects, improve your resiliency, and thereby become a more effective leader. Welcome to our last module in the self-awareness course. As with all the other modules, I'd like to begin today with my leadership observation. Leadership is not a spectator sport. You have to play in order to be successful. We'll come back and revisit another part of that observation at the end of the module. For now, let's begin our discussion of problem solving. Here are our objectives for the module. Understanding the differences between analytical and creative problem solving. These are the 2 techniques that you'll be using throughout most of your experience and work as a practicing engineering leader. We're going to want to use the creative problem solving process, and while we're doing that, learn how to overcome the barriers to creativity. We will want to assess your creative style. This will be one of the assessments that you'll be doing as part of this module. And lastly, we'll review some brainstorming techniques that you can use to help stimulate generating creative alternatives to problems. Let's now continue with how do we deal with information gaps? As we look at both analytical problem solving and creative problem solving, we don't always have all of the information that we'll need to solve the problem. So where do we get that information? How do we fill the gaps so that we can proceed effectively to solve the problems? Well, the answer is we make assumptions. Where do those assumptions come from? They come from our personal experiences, our values, our observations on how things work in the world around us. If you doubt that you make assumptions, I'd like to share with you in a moment a picture. As you look at that picture, you will recognize that you respond to it in a certain way based on your expectations about what might happen next. So with that in mind, take a look. As you look at this picture, think about what you're feeling, what you know from your personal experiences might be going on and might happen next. While making assumptions is useful in solving creative problems, it can also be a pitfall. Obviously, we don't have the context for this picture. We don't have all of the information that we might need, only a small portion of it. And that in itself can be a pitfall as we approach solving creative problems. Now that we've examined the role that assumptions play in our decision-making process, let's take a look more specifically at the two types of problem-solving techniques that you are likely to use as engineers and as engineering leaders. As we examine these two types of problem solving, we're going to want to answer these three questions. Are the outcomes predictable? Do we have sufficient information to solve the problem? And do the means and ends have a connection? If the answer to these three questions is yes, then we're on the pathway to analytical problem solving. Here, the methods that you're probably most familiar with because you use this technique every day is to define the problem, generate solutions, evaluate those alternatives, and implement and follow up on the solution. As you look at this particular process, there are some pitfalls. Frequently, it's difficult to define the problem sufficiently well. Many faults in solving problems lie in not defining the problem correctly from the very start. Frequently, as we generate solutions, we don't generate sufficient ones, or we get hung up on selecting the first available solution. So we can create problems for ourselves by not generating enough and sufficiently quality solutions. We may have difficulty evaluating the solutions that we do come up with. There may be disagreement among team members about what criteria should be used, and that will be based on their experiences and values as well. There could be difficulty in implementing solutions in this particular type of problem solving. That becomes especially true in circumstances where change will happen. Change always creates tension and can create problems in implementing effective solutions. If this technique looks familiar, it ought to. From your early days in junior high school or perhaps earlier, you've probably become familiar with the scientific method. It is a well-organized process for generating solutions to scientific problems. The analytical problem-solving process is another way of restating the scientific method. As we return to the problem assessment, if the answer to those questions is no, we are on a different pathway. We may find ourselves looking at creative problem-solving approaches where, again, we have to have good problem definition from the start, and we have to examine ways of generating many different solutions to the problem. You're going to find that we will emphasize volume of solutions as opposed to well-defined, narrower solutions to problems. But just like the analytical problem-solving process, the creative problem-solving process is subject to some pitfalls of its own. Here we refer to the constancy, commitment, compression, and complacency blocks that you may come across in solving problems creatively. We will examine each of these in detail a little bit later on in this lesson. As we look at creative problem solving, what are the steps that we follow? Or when do we actually use it? It's going to be used when we want to create something new, something that is out of the realm of what we already know. It's going to be used when there's no best answer, no optimum answer, and we may need a range of answers to solve our problems. As we implement creative problem solving, there are some well-defined stages that we'll go through. There's a preparation phase in which we collect information that we are going to need to solve the problem, to think about it and to define the problem as best we can at this stage, recognizing that perhaps later on in the problem-solving process we may have to restate the problem. There is an incubation period. I have found in my own experience in trying to solve problems creatively that I require some soak time. That is time where I can reflect on the problem statement and the options that are available as we go about solving the problem. That's extremely important, and I think as you go about solving problems creatively, you may need to build in some time for incubation. There's always that moment in the creative solving process where the light bulb goes on, where there's inspiration and insight that you gain into solving the problem, and this is called the illumination stage. Once you've experienced that light going on and the illumination process, you'll move to the verification stage. This is analogous to the implementation phase of the analytical problem-solving process. Here, you'll want to assess the potential solutions, make sure that the insights that you've gained through illumination are applied to select the best solution for your particular problem. Now that we've introduced the concepts of conceptual blocks to creative thinking, let's explore each of these in a little bit more detail, beginning with the constancy block. The barriers within the constancy block are vertical thinking as opposed to lateral thinking, and using a single thinking language as opposed to multiple thinking languages. Vertical thinking is being stuck in a certain way of solving a problem. Single thinking language is using only words instead of other possible thinking languages, and I'll give you examples of those in a moment. As we look at the vertical way of thinking versus lateral, the term vertical thinking was coined by Edward de Bono, and I'll compare and contrast those now. Vertical thinking is much like, and will sound much like, the analytical problem-solving process that we described earlier in this module. Lateral thinking will be much more characteristic of the creative problem-solving process. So this comparison will give you some sense for the differences between analytical and creative problem-solving. Vertical thinking tends to be concerned with continuity, lateral thinking with discontinuity. Vertical thinking chooses, whereas lateral thinking changes. Vertical thinking will be concerned with stability, whereas lateral thinking will be concerned with instability. Vertical thinking searches for what is right, whereas lateral thinking will be searching for what's different. Differences drive change and stimulate imagination and creativity. Vertical thinking is very analytical, whereas lateral thinking will be very provocative. Vertical thinking is concerned with where did the idea come from. Lateral thinking, as you might expect, then focuses on where is the idea going. Analytical thinking develops the idea. Lateral thinking is more concerned about discovering new ideas. So here you see the essence of the difference between analytical problem solving and lateral thinking. Let's move on now to talk about the multiple thinking languages constancy block. When we're solving problems, we typically express those in terms of words. If that's the only language that we use, we miss opportunities to express and develop problems using other thinking languages like symbols, sense of smell, visual imagery, and feelings and emotions. When we're in groups that are trying to solve problems creatively, we're going to want to try to use all of these techniques to end up with creative solutions to problems. The more languages we use, the more likely we are to come up with a creative solution to the problem. I'd like to close our discussion of the constancy block with a quick mental test. We're frequently stuck in ways of thinking, and this is the classic matchstick problem where you're asked to make this mathematical expression true by moving only one matchstick. If we're stuck in a constancy block, we would have difficulty solving this problem. However, when we begin to use lateral thinking techniques and explore other ways of thinking, we might be able to come up with this solution. As you approach trying to solve problems creatively, be concerned and aware of the pitfalls of constancy conceptual blocks. Now that we've examined the constancy block in some detail, I personally feel that that is probably the most significant block that you'll encounter in your approaches to solving problems creatively. But let's now examine the other three types of conceptual blocks. beginning with the commitment block. Here, we can be trapped into perceptually stereotyping a problem, and that is being attached to our past experiences to define the current problem. Or we could be trapped into ignoring some of the commonalities that exist between problems. My own experience as a researcher suggests that those who could identify commonalities between different problems oftentimes were the most successful in coming up with creative solutions. As we look at compression blocks, here we can oftentimes trap ourselves into assuming constraints on a problem that don't really exist. Or we could be guilty of not distinguishing the figure from the ground. This is a term that draws from the field of photography, where depth of field can be narrowed to highlight the figure and distinguish it from the background. Here's an example of a compression type of problem. Many of us are familiar with this example because it's been around for many, many years. The challenge here is to connect all 9 dots with 4 lines. Frequently, when a person first encounters this problem, he will approach it by staying within the box. However, if we remove that constraint, we can in fact draw 4 straight lines through all 9 dots, albeit having to draw outside the box. Since most of us have seen that one, I would like to up the challenge a little bit. Can you draw using only 3 lines to connect all 9 dots? Again, you're going to have to overcome the compression block, overcome your assumptions to come up with a solution that might look like this. And while this one is interesting, I challenge you again. Can you connect all 9 dots with a single line? If you remove the constraint about the width of the line, then you might come up with a solution that looks a bit like that. Let's move on now to the complacency blocks. I mentioned earlier in this lesson that complacency is in effect becoming a little bit lazy. It can be lazy in 2 ways. One is just not asking the questions that need to be asked. Not having someone in the group who's willing to be what we would call the devil's advocate, or be willing to challenge the status quo. I've found that in most creative groups, they work most effectively when there's at least one person in the group willing to challenge the ideas that are presented. The other one is just a bias against thinking. It's being a little bit mentally lazy. Are you willing to do the work that it takes to be creative? It's a chaotic process, and for many of us who are engineers, it's a little bit uncomfortable. Now that we've explored the conceptual blocks to creativity, let's take a little closer look at the 4 approaches to creativity in groups. We begin with incubation. This is characterized by an approach where teams work together over sustained periods of time to generate their ideas. It tends to be a slow process. Ideas percolate and grow over time in this particular setting. As we look at the imagination approach to creativity, this is characterized by the big ideas. Typically, will be multidisciplinary types of approaches and will create those revolutionary and groundbreaking ideas. When we look at the investment approach, this is really the approach of getting there first with your idea. So the emphasis here is on speed. Lastly, we have the incremental improvements that are characteristic of a lot of the work that engineers will do. Here we're working on incremental improvements to existing processes or products or services. With these 4 approaches to creativity in mind, let's begin to explore how do we improve creativity in ourselves, in teams, and in our leadership roles. So as we look at how do you improve your creativity as an individual, let's think about, first of all, giving yourself time to reflect, time to absorb, time to define the problem, time to generate creative alternatives. Creative problem solving is not a fast process, and you're going to have to give yourself adequate time to accomplish it. Find places where you can think. For myself, I know I need to have periods of quiet time to reflect. There are other times where I need to be in a group and it's a little more chaotic, but that quiet time is extremely important to give you reflection and generate those creative solutions. Share your ideas with other people. The opportunity to do that allows you to express the problem and put it into words such that you can explain it, develop it, and get the benefit of other people's perspectives. Ask for suggestions. Ask for those things that you can do that might be helpful in generating solutions. I encourage you to read a lot. The more broadly you read, the more you will be able to apply those lateral thinking principles that we talked about earlier. Try to isolate yourself from those who would be what I call idea killers, those who will be prone to criticizing and evaluating ideas before the appropriate time in the creative problem-solving process. Let's move now to talking about facilitating creativity in groups. One of the approaches here is to disturb the equilibrium of the group. Once groups tend to become static, they get stuck in ways of thinking. So you're going to want to look for ways to disrupt that equilibrium. Here are some of the ways that you can do that. One is to change the composition of the group. Occasionally pull people out, bring additional perspectives in, but that change in dynamic will help stimulate creative thought. Don't be afraid to hold people accountable. Monitor and prod the people around you. Make them contribute to the process. Don't allow people to be spectators as opposed to participants in the process. One of the things that you want to do is encourage people to assume multiple roles. Some people will assume these very naturally because it's consistent with their personality, but some of the roles that you might want to recognize as you approach the creative process are the idea champion. Who is that person in that team who can really sell the idea? Who's the sponsor? Who's willing to devote resources and support generating not only the solutions but the implementations of those? Who is the person who administratively guides the group through the creative problem-solving process and facilitates all of the administrative things that go on within the team? And lastly, you need to encourage the person who will be the devil's advocate or the rule breaker, somebody who will, again, disturb the equilibrium of the group so that you can move towards creative solutions. One of the ways to encourage creative problem solving is to generate lots of alternatives. Many of us are familiar with the term brainstorming, and that will be one of the key techniques that we'll use throughout the creative problem solving process. But when you do that, make sure that you don't prematurely judge the ideas that are generated. So defer judgment when you're brainstorming. Wait till all of the ideas are collected before you start the evaluation process. Try to expand beyond the current alternatives, whether it's redefining the problem or generating as many wild ideas as you can. Try to combine unrelated attributes of the problem in such a way that you can generate new ideas. As I mentioned before, some of the rules of brainstorming will be: don't evaluate ideas before their time. Encourage those wild ideas. You never know. Those wild ideas can be a point of departure for generating entirely new lines of thought that will result in a creative solution. As you go through brainstorming, make sure you get lots of ideas. Try to stimulate as many as you can, as fast as you can. Build on the ideas of others. So once you reach a block, survey the ideas that have been generated by other members of the team and see if there's some ideas there that might encourage you or stimulate your thought process to take it another step beyond or to go in a different direction. Let's now consider what your responsibilities might be if you were in a lead role in a team that is charged to solve problems creatively. You're going to have to balance multiple aspects of the creative problem-solving process. One of the ways you're going to have to do that is how do you bring in fresh perspectives without losing sight of traditional ways of doing things? There is some benefit in both of those, and you're going to have to balance those issues. You're going to have to give the team freedom, but not so much that they don't drive towards solution. They have to have space in order to be creative. You're going to need to encourage some playfulness. Having fun and generating ideas is going to be important in generating lots of ideas and solutions, but that has to be balanced with making sure that you're serious enough to drive to an effective solution. Improvisation will be important in stimulating lots of ideas, building on the ideas of others, whether it's continuing along the same idea line or diverging along a different path. But balancing that with, again, enough focus to move to a solution will be extremely important. In your creative solving problem process, you're going to need to balance experience with new ideas. I mentioned earlier the possibility of bringing in new people to change the dynamic or the equilibrium of the group. So you're going to need to balance that experience level with people who know how to solve problems creatively with bringing in new people to offer a fresh perspective. You're going to have to balance discipline with that playfulness that I talked about earlier. You can't be so restrictive that you limit the process, but you also have to have enough discipline to generate a timely solution to the problem. In all of the process, you have to balance professionalism with that playfulness aspect I mentioned earlier. Being professional, delivering a solution is ultimately what it's all about. As you think about solving problems creatively, don't forget that planning is important, but don't let it become so restrictive that it limits your ability to solve problems creatively. Just as with the analytical problem-solving process, there are potential pitfalls as we follow the steps in the creative problem-solving process. We refer to these pitfalls as conceptual blocks. These are mistakes or obstacles that could cause us to either limit our definition or define the problem inappropriately, or limit the range of options that we consider for solutions. Let's take a look now at some of the specific types of conceptual blocks. The first of these is the constancy block. Most often in team settings, when I hear the expression, "we've always done it that way," that's an indicator to me of the presence of a conceptual block. It's being stuck in one way of looking at problems. A second type of block is the commitment block. Here is where members of your team or yourself may become emotionally attached to a particular solution that you've come up with. This can be particularly dangerous in that it is difficult to let loose of those emotional ties to your pet ideas. The compression block. This frequently occurs where we assume limitations on ourselves that aren't actually there. We imagine ourselves in a box that doesn't really exist. And lastly, the complacency block. We all get lazy sometimes. And when that happens in the creative problem-solving process, we lose energy and we don't drive on to finding appropriate creative solutions. As part of this module, you completed 3 self-assessments related to creativity and creative problem solving. I'd like now to look at more closely the elements of creative style self-assessment. The elements here that appear mirror very closely the 4 approaches to creative problem solving that we discussed earlier in the module: imagination, incubation, investment, and improvement. As you look at the results of your self-assessment, you're likely to find that you have one or more dominant aspects of your creative style. The trick as you begin to apply this self-assessment in your work setting will be to find those situations where your dominant style closely aligns with the needs of the organization. in that vein, I'd like to share with you now my own self-assessment on creative style. What you'll see in this assessment is that my dominant styles tend to be the imagination and incubation styles. As it turned out in my own career as a research and development scientist, these two styles lent themselves to the environment that I was in, whether it was creating new ideas, new ways of creating chemical processes, or ways of developing new ideas over a long period of time. And that was particularly useful as I became a team leader supervising those engineers and scientists that were over the long haul trying to generate improvements to processes in the industry. And for our last reflection, journal reflection in this course, we're again coming to you from the Heinemann Garden on the Rice campus. And today I have a recollection from my early days at Shell, where I was working on a pilot plant for gas treating, a gas treating process. It was a process that handled gases, liquids, and solids. So by definition, it violated the first principle of chemical engineering when dealing with solids: don't. One of the pieces of equipment in that pilot plant was a static mixer. And the elements in that mixer were arranged so that they were butted up against each other in sequence through the mixer. During one of our shutdowns to do maintenance, I noticed as I looked at those mixers that the interface between mixers was where most of the solids fouling occurred in the process. As I began to look at that, I considered ways of eliminating that interface so that we would reduce the fouling. That's when I came up with the idea of separating the elements so that that interface did not exist. In the end, that particular choice proved to be very successful and ended up being a critical part of our commercial designs for that process. So, my challenge for you, based on this reflection, is what observations are you making, or have you made, or can make, that might make a huge difference in the way you do things, in the way you operate? Welcome to the Leadership Tools segment of our fifth and last module in this course. As all of us were growing up through elementary school and junior high and high school, we were taught to write outlines for our projects and papers that we were going to write. While it's a powerful technique to help us organize our thoughts in a logical manner that promotes clarity in the final result, it is subject to vertical thinking, a term that we came across in this module that oftentimes forces us to think in a linear manner. Over 20 years ago, I was introduced to the concept of mind mapping. This is a very powerful technique that can help remove the barriers of linear thinking in that vertical thinking style of an outline and allow us to do more free-form idea generation using graphical techniques. I'm going to demonstrate this technique for you today as a way of encouraging you to use it in your own work. I've picked the example of that could be familiar to many of you, and that is moving to a new job. We begin by writing our main topic in the center of our board, and off of this we are going to generate branches, main lines of thought or concepts that we want to capture. We can move from branch to branch as we stimulate new ideas, so we're not constrained in that linear thinking. As I think about going to a new job, one of the first things that I would want to do is, what are those actions that I'm going to take before I go? So I call those pre-arrival actions. One of the things that I may choose to do is talk to my new boss to find out what is the new job going to be like? Who are some of the people that I might be working with? I might want to talk to the HR staff in that new location. Are there any particular actions that I need to take care of before I even arrive on site? There could well be health and safety and environmental staff that I need to work with? Are there any training requirements or other prerequisites that I need to complete before I actually arrive on site? I know many sites require a certain amount of safety training before you even go there. Those might be some of the pre-arrival things that I take into account. As I do that, I might want to worry about what's the job content going to be. As I go to my new job, what are those responsibilities that I will have? What are the duties? What are the deliverables that I'm going to have to be concerned about? As I do that, I might like to know what the scope is going to be. What are the limits? What kind of authorities might I have? I might like to know who are some of the people that I'll be working with. What are the key relationships that I might have to develop and build? And what are some of the key people that are going to be in my own group? What staff am I going to be working with that I'm going to have to help or will have to help me get things done? If I'm going to be relocating as part of this job, one of the things I'm going to be extremely concerned about is relocation. If I'm going to relocate, that brings a whole host of new issues to the table. I have to move my office, and I might have to move my family. And that brings up the issues of logistics. How am I going to move my family, my personal belongings, my office files, which could include my computer. So there's an IT aspect to this, where how do I move my computer files, all of the tools that I use on a daily basis, how do I get them transferred to my new location? I might also have to worry about, as I arrive, I have my pre-arrival actions, but what about those things that I do after I arrive in the new job? I might want to think about those things ahead of time so that I have a plan from that very first day that I set foot on site. I may want to, who are the people that I need to meet that first day? What is my schedule for the first week? I should have that mapped out so that I know what appointments I'm going to have, I know what office calls I need to make, I know what I need to do to get settled into my new workspace. As I think about it, there may also be some actions that I need to take before I leave my old workspace, and that would be those things that I would call farewell actions. Who are the people that I want to say goodbye to? We may have a celebration. People may want to wish me well as I go off to my new job. I want to make sure that I've closed out all of the actions from my current job. Is there any paperwork or actions pending that I need to make sure are closed out? I may need to hand off certain activities to my successor so that he or she can do that in a very efficient way. As I think about it, there may also be, in that new job, what are some of the networks that I'm going to have to develop? Call these. I'm going to have to meet with people that I would consider suppliers. Those that I might consider customers, and those that I would consider my stakeholders. All of those are people that I will need to meet face-to-face if possible, and certainly connect with them as I begin my new job responsibilities. This then gives you a picture of how this technique might be usable for you. Very rapidly, I can generate ideas. I can move from branch to branch when I need to as I think of new ideas. In this vein, it lets us think very broadly, very lateral thinking that we described in the creative problem-solving process. I personally have found this technique to be extremely valuable to me when I find that I want to explore an idea that's new. I encourage you to use this to stimulate your own creative thinking as you approach problems in your leadership journey. Now that we're approaching the end of this module, it's time to revisit my observation on leadership. You recall that I said that leadership is not a spectator sport. You have to play to be successful. But in the end, ultimately, it's your decision whether or not you play. Let's review now what we covered in this module. We talked about analytical problem solving. This is a style that you're most familiar with because you use it every day in solving your engineering problems. We then talked about creative problem solving and the different approaches to creative problem solving: investment, incubation, improvement, and imagination. We then talked about the blocks that you could encounter to solving problems creatively: the constancy block, compression, commitment, and complacency. We then moved to talking about tips for improving creativity, first as an individual, then within teams, and then how you might have to balance the tensions within a team in order to solve problems creatively. We then spent some time talking about the creative style assessment that you did as part of this module, and I reviewed my own results to show how it helped reinforce my role as a research scientist. And lastly, we talked about a creative tool for you to put in your leadership toolkit, and that is the technique of mind mapping, a way to generate ideas free form. Hopefully through this module, you've developed some ideas and some skills that will help you become a better creative problem solver in those situations where you will need to take a different approach other than the analytical method that you already know.